The marshal's voice cut through the packed courtroom like a blade. "Mrs. Thornton, where did you sleep last night?" Margaret's hands gripped the witness stand rail. Every eye in Silver Creek was on her. One wrong answer, and she'd lose everything. Her husband, her home, her children. "In my husband's bed," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her thin throat. "Where a wife belongs." Deputy Morrison's smile was triumphant. "How interesting, because just 2 weeks ago, a witness saw you in separate rooms." The judge's gavel cracked. Margaret's heart hammered. This was it. The moment that would decide whether her children stayed with her or were torn away forever. But to understand how a desperate widow with 4 starving children ended up on trial for her life in a Montana courtroom, we need to go back to where it all began. To a frozen train platform, a letter from a dead man, and the brother who would change everything. In 3 weeks, the entire town of Silver Creek would watch her stand before a judge and confess to a lie. They would call her a fraud, a schemer. Some would demand she hang. But right now, stepping off the train with 4 starving children and a letter from a dead man, Margaret Ashford didn't know any of that yet. All she knew was this: she had answered an ad for a mail-order bride, and the man who sent it was already in the ground. The wind had teeth that November afternoon. It came down from the mountains sharp and mean, carrying snow that wasn't quite snow, yet just frozen promise in the air. The train station at Silver Creek sat at the edge of everything, a wooden platform worn smooth by boots in weather surrounded by prairie grass gone yellow and brittle. Beyond that, mountains rose like broken teeth against the sky, the color of old iron. Margaret stood on this platform with one hand gripping a battered leather suitcase and the other holding her youngest child against her hip. Baby Jonah was 18 months old, his face pressed into the hollow of her shoulder, his breath warm against her neck. He hadn't made a sound since morning. That worried her more than if he'd been crying. The other 3 children clung to her skirts like shadows. Samuel was 10 tall for his age, with his father's dark hair and eyes that had learned too young to be careful. Ruth was 7, small and pale, clutching a cloth doll with one arm missing. Lily was 4, her blonde curls matted beneath a bonnet 2 sizes too large, her thumb wedged firmly in her mouth, though Margaret had tried for months to break the habit. They stood together in a tight cluster, breathing clouds of vapor into the cold air, while other passengers hurried past them toward wagons and waiting families. No one looked at them twice. No one stopped. Margaret's fingers tightened on the letter in her coat pocket. She'd read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases, threatening to tear. The words were burned into her memory now. Thomas Thornton seeks God-fearing woman for marriage. Ranch needs a mother's hand. 4 children welcome. Reply by November. She had replied, had written back in careful script, her best handwriting telling him about herself in the vaguest possible terms. Widow, 4 children, hard worker, good with numbers. She hadn't mentioned Henry, hadn't mentioned the whispers that followed her out of Kansas like smoke, hadn't mentioned the way people crossed the street when they saw her coming, or how the grocer's wife had spit at her feet outside the church. Thomas Thornton had written back, said to come, said there was room, said he'd meet her at the station. But the man walking toward her now across the platform was not the man from the photograph. That man had been smaller, softer around the edges, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. This man was tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the kind of careful economy that spoke of years spent working with his hands. His hat was pulled low against the wind. His coat was dark wool worn at the elbows. His face looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the mountains behind him, all hard angles and weathered plains. He stopped 3 feet away and looked at her. His eyes were blue, the pale, cold blue of winter sky. "You, Margaret Ashford." His voice was low and rough like gravel underfoot. Margaret's throat went dry. "I am. I'm Caleb Thornton." He paused, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he didn't want to swallow. "Thomas's brother." The wind filled the silence between them. Margaret felt Samuel's hand tighten in hers. "Thomas died 3 weeks back." Caleb said, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "Horse threw him checking fence line, broke his neck. Buried him up on the hill behind the house." The world tilted. Margaret's knees went liquid. She locked them, forced herself to stay upright. Baby Jonah whimpered against her shoulder. Her voice came out thin and distant. "I didn't know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for your loss." Caleb's expression didn't change. You should take the next train back east. There's one comes through tomorrow morning. I... Margaret looked down at her children. Samuel was staring at the ground, his small shoulders rigid. Ruth had started to cry silently, tears tracking down her dirty cheeks. Lily's thumb had fallen from her mouth, her eyes wide and frightened. I can't, Margaret said quietly. Can't or won't. Both. She lifted her chin, met his eyes. I spent everything I had on the tickets here. There's nothing to go back to. That ain't my problem, ma'am. I know. Her voice was steady now, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. I'm not asking for charity. I can work. I can cook, clean, mend. I can keep books. I'm good with numbers. I don't eat much and I don't complain. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then his gaze dropped to the children. His eyes lingered on baby Jonah, then moved to Samuel, to Ruth, to little Lily. 4 mouths, he said, on a ranch, barely feeding 2 men and a dog. Margaret felt something crack open inside her chest. She'd heard it before. Heard it in every face that had turned away from her in Kansas. Heard it in every door that had closed. Too many, too much, too hard. She bent down, set her suitcase on the platform, straightened, looked at Caleb Thornton with all the dignity she could gather. Then I won't trouble you further. Thank you for coming to tell me about your brother. She picked up the suitcase again, turned toward the empty street beyond the station. She had no idea where she was going, no idea what she would do, but she would not beg. Not again. She'd left her pride in too many places already. Ma'am, Caleb's voice stopped her. She turned back. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. His hands hung loose at his sides. The wind pushed at his coat. What can you do? Margaret blinked. I told you, I can cook, clean. No, he cut her off. What can you do? Can you survive a Montana winter with 4 kids and no help? Can you work when your hands are so cold you can't feel your fingers? Can you kill a chicken and pluck it and cook it and not waste a single scrap? Margaret thought of the last year, thought of the nights she'd gone without eating so the children could have her portion, thought of the times she'd walked 3 miles in the rain to sell eggs at half price because no one in town would buy from her. Thought of the morning she'd woken to find frost on the inside of the windows and no wood for the fire, and she'd torn apart an old chair and burned it piece by piece to keep the children warm. Yes, she said, I can do all of that and more. Caleb studied her. She felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing measuring, assessing. Finally, he nodded once, sharp, decided, getting at the wagon. He turned and walked away toward a buckboard wagon hitched to 2 draft horses. Didn't look back to see if she followed. Margaret stood frozen for a heartbeat. Then Samuel tugged at her hand. Mama, his voice was small. She looked down at her son, saw the question in his eyes, the fear, the fragile hope. Come on, she said quietly. They followed Caleb to the wagon. He was already in the driver's seat gathering the reins. Margaret lifted the children up one by one. Samuel climbed up on his own, then turned to help Ruth. Lily scrambled up between them. Margaret handed Jonah to Samuel, then climbed up herself, her suitcase clutched awkwardly in one hand. There was a moment when she thought Caleb might change his mind, might tell them to get down. But he just clicked his tongue at the horses and the wagon lurched forward. They rode in silence. The road led west out of town, a rutted track that wound through open prairie. The grass stretched away on both sides, rolling in waves beneath the wind. In the distance, the mountains rose higher, their peaks white with early snow. Margaret held Jonah close. The warmth of the children pressed against her was the only warm thing in the world. She could feel the cold seeping through her thin coat, could feel it in her bones. Winter was coming fast. She could taste it in the air. After what felt like hours, Caleb spoke without looking at her. You got any other family? No. Husband's people? They didn't want anything to do with me after he died. Caleb was quiet for a moment, then, how'd he die? Margaret's hand went instinctively to her left wrist beneath her sleeve. The burn had healed months ago, but she could still feel it sometimes, a phantom pain that flared up in the cold. Wagon accident, she said. He was drunk, drove off the road, broke his neck. It was the truth, just not all of it. Caleb nodded slowly, like he was turning this information over in his mind, looking at it from different angles. People blame you for it. Margaret's breath caught. She turned to look at him, but his eyes were fixed on the road ahead. Yes, she said finally. Did you do it? No. Another silence. Then Caleb said so quiet she almost didn't hear him. Doesn't much matter. Sometimes does it. What's true? Only matters what people believe. Margaret didn't answer. There was nothing to say to that. The sun was setting when they finally saw the ranch. It appeared gradually emerging from the landscape like something that had grown there rather than been built. A main house low and solid built from logs chinked with mud and stone. A barn larger than the house with a gambrel roof and double doors. A smaller outbuilding that might have been a bunkhouse. Corrals and fencing stretching away into the dusk. And beyond it all, the mountains rising up like a wall against the darkening sky. Caleb brought the wagon to a stop in front of the smaller building. He climbed down without a word, then stood looking up at Margaret and the children. Bunkhouse, he said, gesturing to the building. 2 rooms, stove works. Roof don't leak much. You can stay here tonight. Margaret climbed down carefully, then lifted the children down one by one. Samuel jumped down on his own landing, hard in the dirt. Caleb walked to the bunkhouse door and pushed it open. The hinges creaked. He disappeared inside for a moment, then there was the scratch of a match and lamplight bloomed in the windows. When he came back out, he was carrying a ring of keys. He held them out to Margaret. Water pumps around back. Privy's 20 yards east. Don't go wandering after dark. Wolves come down from the hills sometimes. Margaret took the keys. Their fingers didn't touch. Thank you, she said. Caleb nodded once, then turned and walked away toward the main house. His boots crunched in the gravel. He didn't look back. Margaret stood watching until he disappeared inside and lamplight filled those windows too. Then she turned to her children. Come on, she said. Let's see what we have. The bunkhouse was spare but clean. The main room held a table, 3 chairs, and a pot-bellied stove with a stack of split wood beside it. The second room was smaller, just big enough for a narrow bed and a trunk. The mattress was thin, but it smelled like cedar, shun, and sun like it had been aired recently. The windows had thick curtains that could be drawn against the cold. Margaret got a fire going in the stove while Samuel explored the trunk and found 2 wool blankets carefully folded. Ruth discovered a box of matches and some candles on a shelf above the table. Lily pressed her nose against the window, watching the last light fade from the sky. There was a knock at the door just as full dark settled. Margaret opened it to find Caleb standing there with a basket. He held it out without meeting her eyes. Bread, he said. Some jerky, jar of soup. Figured you'd be hungry. Thank you, Margaret said. We are. He nodded, started to turn away, then stopped. Tomorrow, he said, still not looking at her. You'll want to be up before dawn. Work starts early. Miguel will show you what needs doing. Miguel. Ranch hand. He's been with me 15 years. Caleb shifted his weight, uncomfortable. You prove you can work. Maybe I'll let you stay on a while. But I ain't making promises. I don't need promises, Margaret said. Just a chance. Caleb looked at her, then really looked at her, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes. Something that might have been pain, or might have been recognition, or might have been nothing at all. Lock the door, he said. Then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness between the bunkhouse and the main house. Margaret closed the door, set the basket on the table. The bread was still warm, wrapped in a clean cloth. The soup jar was heavy, full of something that smelled like beef and vegetables. The jerky was dark and looked homemade. She divided everything carefully among the children, making sure each got an equal share. They ate in silence, too hungry for words. When they were done, she wiped their faces with the cloth from the bread and settled them on the bed with the blankets pulled up to their chins. Mama, Ruth's voice was small in the darkness. Are we staying here? I don't know, baby. I hope we can stay, Lily whispered. It's warm. Samuel said nothing, but Margaret could see him staring at the ceiling, his jaw tight. She sat on the edge of the bed with Jonah asleep in her arms, listening to the wind outside and the crackle of the fire in the stove. Through the window, she could see lamplight still burning in the main house. Somewhere in the night, a wolf howled. The sound was lonely and wild, and it made her think of everything she'd left behind. Everything she'd lost. Everything she might still lose. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the locket. It was the only thing she owned that had any value, the only thing she'd kept when she'd sold everything else. Silver tarnished now with a delicate chain. Her mother had given it to her on her wedding day, and her mother had gotten it from her mother before that. Margaret opened it. Inside were two tiny photographs carefully cut to fit. On one side, all four of her children, together taken 2 years ago, when things had still been good. On the other side, a photograph of her mother, young and smiling, wearing the same locket. She closed it carefully and tucked it back into her pocket. Then she lay down beside her children, fully clothed, and pulled the blanket over them all. Sleep didn't come. She lay in the darkness, feeling the weight of Jonah against her chest, listening to the breathing of her other children, and thought about the man who had written to her, Thomas Thornton, a stranger who had offered her hope and then died before she could even meet him, and his brother Caleb, a man who clearly wanted nothing to do with her or her children, but who had given them shelter anyway, who had brought them food, who had said maybe. Outside, the wind sang through the gaps in the walls. The mountains loomed invisible in the dark, and Margaret lay awake making silent promises to herself. Tomorrow she would work harder than she'd ever worked. She would prove herself. She would earn the right to stay, because there was nowhere else to go, and she was done running. She woke before dawn. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers, and the cold had crept in through every crack and seam in the walls. Her breath came out in clouds. Jonah was still asleep against her, warm and heavy. The other children were tangled together under the blankets, their faces peaceful in sleep. Moving carefully so as not to wake them, Margaret slid out of bed and added wood to the stove. The embers caught quickly, flames licking up around the fresh logs. She pulled her coat tighter and stepped outside. The world was silver with frost. The grass crunched under her feet. The sky was just beginning to lighten in the east, a pale wash of gray against the deeper black. Stars still burned overhead, hard and bright and cold. Margaret found the pump behind the bunkhouse, worked the handle until water gushed out icy and clear. She washed her face and hands, gasping at the cold, then filled a bucket to carry back inside. When she turned around, there was a man standing 20 feet away watching her. He was older than Caleb, maybe 60, with weathered brown skin and iron gray hair beneath a battered hat. He wore work clothes and boots that had seen hard use. His face was lined but kind, his eyes dark and patient. "Buenos dias," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still morning air. "You are the bride." Margaret set the bucket down carefully. The man's dead. "See, Thomas was a good man, I'm sorry." He touched the brim of his hat. "I am Miguel Rodriguez. I work here many years." "Margaret Ashford." She hesitated, then added, "Mr. Thornton said you would show me what needs doing." Miguel's eyebrows rose slightly. "He said you could stay. He said maybe, if I can work." A slow smile spread across Miguel's face. "Ah, then we show him you can work, yes." He gestured toward the barn. "Come, the cows, they do not wait for the sun." Margaret glanced back at the bunkhouse. Through the window, she could see the children still sleeping. "They will be safe," Miguel said, following her gaze. "No one comes here, and I will listen for them." They walked together to the barn. Inside, it smelled of hay and animals and leather. 3 cows stood in stalls, shifting and lowing softly. Miguel showed her how to approach them, how to sit on the low stool, how to grip the teats and pull with a steady rhythm. "Like this," he said, demonstrating, with quick practice of movements. Milk hissed into the bucket in white streams. "You try, I." Margaret sat on the stool. Her hands were stiff with cold and nerves. The first few attempts produced nothing. The cows shifted, impatient. "Relax," Miguel said. "She knows if you are afraid. Be firm but gentle." Margaret tried again. This time milk came. Not much, not steady, but it came. By the end, her hands ached and her back hurt from hunching over, but she had a half bucket of warm, foaming milk. "Good," Miguel said. "Very good for first time. Tomorrow you will do better." They carried the milk to the main house. Miguel knocked once, then pushed open the door without waiting for an answer. The kitchen was larger than the entire bunkhouse. A massive cast-iron stove dominated one wall with copper pots hanging above it. A long wooden table filled the center of the room, scarred and worn smooth by years of use. Windows let in the growing light, showing a room that was clean, but austere, functional rather than comfortable. Caleb sat at the table holding a cup of coffee. He looked up when they entered, his eyes going first to Miguel, then to Margaret, then to the bucket of milk in her hands. He didn't say anything, just nodded once and went back to his coffee. Miguel poured the milk into a large ceramic crock and covered it with a cloth. "For butter later," he explained to Margaret. "Now we feed the chickens." They spent the next 2 hours working. Miguel showed her where the chicken feed was kept, how to scatter it so the hens didn't mob her. Showed her how to gather eggs without spooking the birds, how to check each one for cracks before setting it in the basket. Showed her the vegetable garden, mostly empty now, with winter coming but still with some late carrots and turnips that could be pulled. By the time the sun cleared the mountains, Margaret's hands were numb with cold and her back ached from bending. But she had 3 dozen eggs in her basket and a pile of root vegetables that Miguel said would make good soup. Samuel found her in the garden with Ruth and Lily trailing behind him. Jonah was awake now, fussing against Samuel's shoulder. "Mama," Samuel's voice was tight with worry. "Where were you, working?" Margaret straightened, wincing at the protest in her spine. "Come here, let me see him." Jonah reached for her with both arms, his face red from crying. She took him, settled him on her hip, and he immediately quieted, burying his face in her neck. "You should have woken me," Samuel said. "I could have helped." "I know, next time." She smiled at him, tried to make it reassuring. "Are you hungry?" They were. Margaret brought them to the main house, uncertain if she was allowed, but not knowing where else to go. The door was still open from when she and Miguel had brought in the milk. Inside, Caleb and Miguel sat at the table eating eggs and thick slices of bread. They looked up when Margaret appeared in the doorway with the children. "I apologize for intruding," Margaret said. "I didn't know where else." "Sit," Caleb interrupted. He gestured to the empty chairs. Miguel made enough. It wasn't an invitation so much as a statement of fact, but Margaret took it. She settled the children at the table, and Miguel served them, his movements quick and efficient. Scrambled eggs still hot from the pan, bread with butter, milk creamy and fresh. The children ate like they were afraid the food would disappear if they didn't hurry. Caleb watched them with an expression Margaret couldn't read. His eyes lingered on Jonah, who sat in Margaret's lap and tried to feed himself with his fingers, making more mess than progress. "How old?" Caleb asked. 18 months. Margaret wiped Jonah's face with her sleeve. "He'll be 2 in April." Caleb nodded slowly, looked away. They finished breakfast in silence. When the children were done, Margaret started gathering the plates, but Miguel waved her off. "I clean," he said. "You take the little ones back. Mr. Caleb wants to talk to you." Margaret's stomach tightened. She looked at Caleb, but he was staring into his coffee cup like he could read the future in the dregs. "Samuel," she said quietly, "take your brother and sisters back to the bunkhouse. Stay inside. I'll be there soon." Samuel looked between her and Caleb, his face wary, but he nodded. "Yes, Mama." When the children were gone, Caleb stood and walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her, looking out at the mountains. "Miguel says you did good this morning," he said. "I tried. He also says you got no gloves and your coat's too thin for Montana winter." Margaret didn't answer. There was no point denying what was obviously true. "There's a trunk in the barn," Caleb continued. "My wife's things. Been sitting there 10 years. Coats, gloves, some dresses. You can have what fits." Margaret's throat tightened. "I couldn't." "She's dead," Caleb said flatly. "Been dead a long time. Clothes ain't doing her any good now." He turned to face her then, and the look in his eyes made her chest ache. Grief old and deep, worn smooth by years, but never truly healed. "Thank you," she said softly. Caleb nodded, looked away again. "You can stay through winter, work for your keep. I can't pay you, but you'll have shelter and food. When spring comes," he shrugged. "We'll see." Relief hit her so hard she had to grip the edge of the table to stay standing. "Thank you. You won't regret it. I promise. I'll work hard." "I know you will." His voice was rough. "Or you'll leave. One or the other." He walked past her toward the door, then stopped with his hand on the frame. "One more thing," he said without turning around. "People in town, they were going to talk. They're going to say things. About you living here, about what that means. I know. I don't care what they say, but I won't have them speaking ill of you in front of your children. So we keep to ourselves. We don't give them ammunition. You understand it?" "Yes." Caleb nodded once and left. Margaret stood alone in the kitchen, breathing hard, her hands shaking with exhaustion and relief, and something else she couldn't name. Through the window she could see Caleb walking toward the barn, his shoulders squared against the wind. She thought about his wife, wondered what she'd been like, wondered how she'd died, wondered if Caleb had loved her the way the grief in his eyes suggested. Then she pushed those thoughts away and went to find the trunk. The barn was dim and cool, smelling of hay and horses and old leather. Margaret found the trunk in a corner, covered with a tarp. She pulled the tarp away and lifted the lid. Inside were clothes carefully folded, smelling faintly of cedar. A heavy wool coat, dark blue with buttons made of horn. Several dresses, simple but well made. Gloves, scarves, a knitted shawl. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, a white nightgown with lace at the collar and cuffs. Margaret lifted the coat and held it up. It would fit her more or less. Maybe a little long, but that didn't matter. It was warm and whole, and it would keep the Montana winter at bay. She folded it carefully and set it aside. Then she went through the rest, selecting what she and the children could use. A smaller coat that might fit Ruth, gloves for Samuel, the shawl for herself. At the very bottom of the trunk, beneath everything else, she found a photograph in a simple wooden frame. A woman young and pretty, with dark hair and gentle eyes. She was smiling at the camera, one hand resting on her swollen belly. Behind her, barely visible, stood a younger version of Caleb, his hand on her shoulder, looking at her like she was the only thing in the world worth seeing. Margaret stared at the photograph for a long time. Then she carefully wrapped it in the tissue paper and placed it back at the bottom of the trunk beneath the nightgown. Some things were meant to stay buried. The days fell into a rhythm after that. Margaret woke before dawn and worked until after dark. She learned the ranch the way you learn a language, one word at a time. The names of the coos: Bessie, Daisy, Belle. The trick to getting the gate on the chicken coop to latch properly. The best place to hang laundry so it would dry even in the cold. The way the wind sounded different when snow was coming. Miguel taught her patiently, showing her things 2 or 3 times if she didn't get them right the first time. He never got frustrated, never made her feel stupid. When she asked questions, he answered them thoughtfully. Caleb, on the other hand, barely spoke to her. He gave instructions through Miguel or left notes on the kitchen table. Fix the fence by the south pasture. Mend the harness. Check the water pump. She did everything he asked and more. Cleaned the main house from top to bottom, scrubbing floors until her knees were raw. Organized the pantry, inventorying what they had for winter. Patched holes in work shirts and darned socks, worn thin at the heel. The children helped where they could. Samuel followed Miguel everywhere, learning how to muck out stalls and stack hay and mend fence. Ruth gathered eggs and helped Margaret in the kitchen. Even Lily had her jobs, feeding scraps to the chickens and keeping Jonah entertained while Margaret worked. At night, they gathered in the bunkhouse around the stove. Margaret would read to them from the one book they owned, a Bible so worn the cover had fallen off. Sometimes they would just sit in silence, listening to the wind, grateful for the warmth and the food in their bellies. 3 weeks passed, then 4. Winter settled in hard, covering the world in snow. The temperature dropped until Margaret's breath froze on her scarf. The work got harder, more demanding. Hauling water from the pump when the bucket froze to your hands. Breaking ice on the water troughs every morning. Keeping paths clear between the buildings. But Margaret didn't complain. She worked until her body ached and her hands cracked and bled from the cold. She worked because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering Kansas and Henry and all the reasons she'd run. One evening, about a month after she'd arrived, she found a pile of firewood stacked neatly outside the bunkhouse door. Fresh split, the wood still pale where the axe had bitten. She hadn't split it. She'd been planning to, but there hadn't been time. The next morning, she found the children's boots sitting on the step, cleaned and oiled, the laces replaced where they'd been frayed. 2 days later, a heavy quilt appeared on the bed, thick and warm, filled with down. No one said anything. No one took credit. But Margaret knew. She found Caleb in the barn that afternoon repairing a bridle. He looked up when she came in, his hands stilling on the leather. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "The firewood, the boots, the quilt." Caleb's jaw tightened. He looked back down at his work. "Don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do." He didn't answer, just threaded the leather through the buckle with careful precision. Margaret stood there for a moment watching him. Then she said quietly, "Your brother Thomas. What was he like?" Caleb's hand stopped moving. For a long moment, he didn't respond. Then, "He was good. Better than me. Kinder. I'm sorry I never got to meet him." "Yeah, me too." Caleb set the bridle aside and stood. "He would have liked you, would have liked the kids. Why did he send for a mail-order bride? Was he lonely?" Caleb's expression shifted, something painful flickering across his face. "He wasn't looking for himself. He was looking for me." Margaret blinked. What? I didn't know he'd placed the ad. He did it behind my back. Figured I needed. He trailed off, shook his head. Doesn't matter now. It matters to me. Caleb looked at her, then really looked at her, and Margaret felt something shift in the air between them. Something fragile and uncertain and terrifying. He thought I needed to start living again, Caleb said finally, instead of just surviving. He was probably right. Before Margaret could respond, before she could even process what he'd said, a voice called from outside. Hello, the house! It was a man's voice, loud and jovial, carrying across the yard. Caleb's expression shuddered immediately. He strode past Margaret toward the barn door. Outside, a man sat on a large bay horse, his badge catching the weak winter sunlight. He was in his 40s, thick through the middle with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Caleb, the man said, swinging down from his horse. Good to see you. Morrison, Caleb's voice was flat. What do you want? Now, is that any way to greet your deputy? Morrison's smile widened. His eyes slid past Caleb to where Margaret stood in the barn doorway. And who might this be? None of your concern. Oh, I think it is. See, I heard something interesting in town. Heard you've got yourself a woman living out here. A woman with 4 kids. That true? Margaret stepped forward before Caleb could answer. I'm Margaret Ashford. I work for Mr. Thornton. Morrison's eyes traveled over her, slowly assessing. Work for him, I see. And what kind of work would that be exactly? Household work. Cooking. Cleaning. Morrison's smile never wavered. And where's your husband, Mrs. Ashford? Dead. I'm sorry to hear that. Recent. A year ago. A year. Morrison nodded slowly. So you came all this way, widow with 4 kids, to work for a bachelor rancher. That about right. Margaret felt her face heat, but she kept her voice steady. I answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride. The man who placed it, Thomas Thornton, died before I arrived. His brother was kind enough to offer me employment rather than turn me away. Mail-order bride. Morrison's tone made the words sound dirty. And do you have proof of this arrangement? Letters A contract. The letters were lost, Margaret said, which was a lie. They were in her suitcase, but she wasn't about to show them to this man. How convenient. Morrison turned to Caleb. You're playing a dangerous game here, Caleb. People talk. They see a woman living on a bachelor's ranch, they're going to draw conclusions. Not good for your reputation. Or hers. I don't give a damn about my reputation, Caleb said coldly. And what people think is their problem, not mine. Maybe so, but there are laws about this sort of thing. Cohabitation, moral turpitude. Morrison's eyes gleamed. Territory doesn't take kindly to that sort of behavior. She's my employee. Can you prove it? You paying her wages, got documentation. Caleb's hands clenched into fists. Get off my land, Morrison. Now, Caleb, I'm just looking out for the community, making sure everything's proper and legal. Morrison climbed back onto his horse. But I'll tell you what, I'm willing to overlook this little situation. For now, on one condition. What condition? That offer I made you last year for your north pasture still stands. In fact, I'll sweeten it. Add another $100. Caleb's voice dropped to something dangerous. My land's not for sale. You sure about that? Because if you're not careful, you might lose more than just your land. Think about it, Caleb. Think hard. Morrison touched his hat to Margaret, his smile sharp as a blade. Ma'am, pleasure meeting you. He rode away, his horse's hooves crunching in the frozen snow. Margaret and Caleb stood in silence, watching him go. When Morrison was just a speck in the distance, Caleb turned to her. I'm sorry, he said. For what? For what's coming. Morrison wants my land. Has for years. He'll use any excuse to cause trouble, and you just gave him one. Margaret's stomach dropped. What will he do? I don't know, but whatever it is, it won't be good. That night, Margaret lay awake long after the children had fallen asleep. Through the window, she could see lamplight burning in the main house. She wondered if Caleb was awake too, wondered if he was regretting his decision to let her stay. She thought about Morrison's smile and the way he'd looked at her, like she was something unclean, something shameful. She'd seen that look before, in Kansas, in the faces of people who'd once called her neighbor, once called her friend. Margaret reached into her pocket and pulled out the locket, opened it, looked at the faces of her children in the dim firelight. She'd come to Montana to escape judgment. to escape whispers and pointed fingers and doors closed in her face. But maybe there was no escaping. Maybe wherever you went, people would always find a reason to condemn you, always find a way to make you feel small and worthless and wrong. She closed the locket and tucked it away. Then she got out of bed and went to the window. The lamplight was still burning in the main house, and Margaret made a decision. If trouble was coming, she would face it. She'd faced worse and survived, and this time she wouldn't face it alone. This time she had Caleb Thornton, a man who'd given her shelter when he didn't have to, who'd shared his food and his firewood and his dead wife's clothes, who'd looked at her like she was a person, not a problem. Whatever Morrison was planning, whatever was coming, they would deal with it. Together. The Sunday morning service at Silver Creek's only church started at 10 o'clock sharp, and Caleb announced on Saturday night that they would all be attending. Margaret looked up from the bread dough she was kneading, flour dusting her hands to the wrists. All of us? All of us. Caleb stood into the kitchen doorway, his hat in his hands. People need to see that this is a respectable arrangement, that you're part of this household, not hiding away like there's something shameful going on. And if they don't believe that, then we make them believe it. Miguel, sitting at the table mending a bridle, glanced between them. Boss, you sure this is wise? Morrison will be there. His friends too. I know. Caleb's jaw was set in that stubborn line Margaret had come to recognize. That's exactly why we're going. So Sunday morning found them all cleaned up and dressed in their best, which wasn't saying much. Margaret wore one of the dresses from the trunk, dark green wool, that she'd taken in at the waist. Ruth and Lily had clean pinafores over their dresses. Samuel wore his only good shirt, the collar starched stiff. Jonah wore whatever would keep him warm and relatively clean for more than 5 minutes. The wagon ride into town was quiet. Margaret held Jonah on her lap and watched the landscape roll past. The snow had melted in patches, leaving the ground brown and muddy. The sky was the color of old pewter, heavy with the promise of more snow to come. Silver Creek on a Sunday morning looked almost peaceful. Smoke rose from chimneys. A few wagons were already parked outside the church, a simple white building with a modest steeple. People stood in small clusters near the entrance, talking in low voices that stopped when Caleb's wagon approached. Margaret felt their eyes like physical weight. She kept her chin up and her gaze forward as Caleb helped her down from the wagon, his hand firm and steady under her elbow. Stay close, he murmured, too low for anyone else to hear. They walked toward the church as a group. Miguel had insisted on coming, despite not being much for church services, walking on Margaret's other side like a silent guardian. The children clustered around them, sensing the tension, even if they didn't understand it. At the door, Reverend Whitfield stood greeting parishioners. He was a tall man in his 50s with gray hair and kind eyes that went wary when he saw their group approaching. Caleb, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Good to see you. It's been a while. Reverend, Caleb nodded. This is Mrs. Margaret Ashford. She's working at the ranch. Reverend Whitfield's eyes moved to Margaret, then to the children, then back to Caleb. I see. Welcome, Mrs. Ashford. Thank you, Reverend. They filed inside. The church was small, with plain wooden pews and windows that let in pale winter light. It smelled of old wood and candle wax and the perfume of too many people crowded into too small a space. Heads turned as they walked down the aisle. Whispers followed them like wind through grass. Margaret kept her eyes forward and her hand on Ruth's shoulder, guiding her into a pew near the back. Caleb sat beside her, creating a barrier between her and the rest of the congregation. The service seemed to last forever. Margaret barely heard the sermon, too aware of the stares burning into her back. She could feel judgment in every glance, condemnation in every whisper. Ruth pressed close against her side, unusually quiet. Even Lily had stopped fidgeting, sensing something was wrong. When the final hymn ended and people began filing out, Margaret hoped they could slip away quickly. But Caleb had other ideas. He stood and offered her his arm, like they were a proper couple, like there was nothing unusual about their situation at all. Outside, people had gathered in small groups, and Margaret could see the way conversations stopped when they approached. Could see the looks, some curious, some disapproving, some outright hostile. A woman detached herself from one group and approached them. She was perhaps 40, dressed in expensive fabric, despite the rural setting, her face pinched with what might have been cold or might have been perpetual displeasure. Caleb Thornton, she said, her voice carrying, I don't believe we've been introduced to your companion. Mrs. McAllister. Caleb's voice was cool. This is Mrs. Margaret Ashford. Mrs. Ashford, this is Mrs. Harriet McAllister. Her husband owns the general store. Mrs. McAllister's eyes swept over Margaret like she was livestock being assessed for purchase. Mrs. Ashford, how interesting. And these children are yours. They are. So many mouths to feed. Mrs. McAllister's smile was sharp. It must be difficult being a widow with such a burden. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her voice level. My children are not a burden, Mrs. McAllister. Of course not. I only meant... Mrs. McAllister trailed off delicately, letting the implication hang in the air. Well, it's fortunate you found employment, with Mr. Thornton, living on his ranch. Margaret works hard, Caleb said, his voice hard, and she's earned her place. I'm sure she has. Mrs. McAllister's tone suggested she was sure of exactly the opposite. It's just that people talk, you understand. A woman living alone with a bachelor. It raises questions about propriety. Then people should mind their own business. Come now, Caleb. We're only concerned for your reputation. And hers, of course. Surely you can see how this looks. Miguel stepped forward, his weathered face calm but his eyes hard. It looks like a man helping una mujer and her niños. Nothing more, señora. Mrs. McAllister's lips thinned. The hired hand speaks now, does he? The hired hand who's known Señor Caleb for 15 years, Miguel said quietly. Who knows he is a good man with a good heart. Perhaps some people should remember that before they speak ill. Color flooded Mrs. McAllister's cheeks. She opened her mouth to respond, but another voice cut through the tension. Now, let's not have harsh words on the Lord's Day. Deputy Morrison approached the same calculating smile from his ranch watchman, now tempered with false concern. He nodded to Mrs. McAllister, then turned to Caleb. Having a little trouble here. No trouble at all, Caleb said flatly. We were just leaving. So soon I was hoping to have a word with you. Morrison's eyes slid to Margaret. About that matter we discussed. There's nothing to discuss. My answer stands. Does it? Morrison's smile widened. Even knowing what's at stake? Caleb's hand tightened on Margaret's arm. Come on, we're going. They walked back to the wagon, the weight of stairs following them. Margaret could hear the whispers starting again louder now, emboldened by Mrs. McAllister's confrontation. In the wagon, none of the children spoke. Samuel stared at his hands. Ruth had tears tracking silently down her face. Even Lily was subdued, her thumb back in her mouth, despite all Margaret's efforts to break the habit. Halfway home, Ruth's voice broke the silence. Mama, why did that lady say those things? Margaret pulled Ruth closer. Some people don't understand, baby. They make judgments without knowing the full story. But we're not doing anything wrong. I know. Then why do they look at us like we are? Margaret had no answer for that. How could she explain to a 7-year-old child that the world was often cruel and unfair, that people would condemn you for surviving however you could, that shame was a weapon wielded by those who'd never known real hardship? Caleb spoke instead, his voice gruff. Because they're small-minded and afraid, they see something they don't understand and they make up stories about it. But that's their problem, not yours. Will they always be mean? Lily asked, her voice muffled around her thumb. No, Caleb said. Eventually they will find something else to talk about. Or they will realize they're wrong. Either way, it doesn't matter what they think. But it did matter. Margaret could see it in the set of Ruth's shoulders, the way Samuel wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. It mattered because these children had already endured enough judgment and scorn in Kansas. They'd come to Montana hoping for a fresh start, and instead they'd found the same cruel whispers and pointed fingers. Back at the ranch, the children scattered to their usual activities. Miguel went to check on the livestock. Margaret started toward the bunkhouse, but Caleb's voice stopped her. Margaret, wait. She turned. He was standing by the wagon, his hat in his hands, turning it slowly. I'm sorry, he said, for what happened, for what they said. It's not your fault. Isn't it I'm the one who insisted we go? I thought if they saw us together, saw that everything was proper. He shook his head. I was wrong. Margaret walked back toward him. You were trying to help. I appreciate that. Even if it made things worse. Even then. She managed a small smile. Besides, I've faced worse than Mrs. McAllister. I know you have. Caleb looked at her, and there was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Respect, maybe, or understanding. You're stronger than you look. I've had to be. They stood there for a moment, the cold wind pushing between them. Then Caleb said, "Come on, let's get you out of this cold." He didn't mean the bunkhouse. He meant the main house. Margaret followed him inside into the warm kitchen that smelled of coffee and wood smoke. Caleb poured 2 cups and handed her one. They sat at the table, the silence between them comfortable for once. "Tell me about your wife," Margaret said quietly. Caleb's hand stilled on his cup. "Why, Bob?" "Because I'm wearing her clothes, living in the home she made. I think I should know something about her." Caleb was quiet for so long, Margaret thought he wouldn't answer. "Then her name was Anna. We married young. She was sweet and kind, and she loved this place almost as much as I did." "How did she die?" "Childbirth, the baby too." His voice was flat, drained of emotion. 10 years ago this February." "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." "That doesn't make it hurt less." Caleb looked at her, then really looked at her, and Margaret saw the depth of his grief laid bare. "No, it doesn't. Is that why Thomas placed the ad? He thought you needed someone?" "Thomas thought I needed a reason to wake up each day," Caleb said finally. "He was probably right, but I fought him on it. Thought I needed a reason to look forward instead of back." Caleb took a drink of his coffee. "He was probably right, but I wasn't ready to hear it. And now he's gone and you're here and nothing turned out the way any of us planned." Margaret wrapped her hands around her cup, feeling the warmth seep into her cold fingers. "My husband Henry, he wasn't always bad. In the beginning he was good to me, gentle. But then things changed. He lost his job, started drinking, and when he drank," she pulled back her sleeve, showing the scar on her wrist. "This was from the stove. He held my hand down on the hot iron until it burned." Caleb's jaw clenched. "Did he hurt the children?" "Once. He hit Samuel hard enough to leave bruises. I told him if he ever touched them again, I'd kill him myself." Margaret's voice was steady. 3 days later, he took the wagon out, drunk, and drove it off the road. Broke his neck. The town said I must have caused it somehow. Said no man just dies like that. They whispered that I'd poisoned him or cut the wagon traces or pushed him somehow. "Did you kill?" "No, but part of me was glad he was dead." She met Caleb's eyes. "Does that make me a bad person?" "No, it makes you human." They sat in silence, drinking their coffee, two broken people trying to make sense of what came next. The days that followed settled into a new pattern. Margaret worked as hard as ever, but now there was a subtle shift in how Caleb treated her. He spoke to her directly instead of leaving notes, asked her opinion on things, joined her and the children for meals instead of eating alone. Small things, but they mattered. One evening, about a week after the disastrous church visit, Margaret was washing dishes when Caleb came in carrying something wrapped in a cloth. He set it on the table with a soft thud. "What's that?" she asked. "Open it." She dried her hands and unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a pair of boots. Good leather, well made, clearly new. "I can't accept these," she said immediately. "Yes, you can. Your boots are worn through. I saw you stuffing them with newspaper to keep your feet dry." "Caleb, it's not charity, Margaret. It's practical. You can't work if your feet are frozen." Margaret ran her fingers over the leather. They were beautiful boots, sturdy and warm and exactly her size. "How did you know what size?" she asked. "I guessed." A pause. "Might have asked Miguel to check your old boots when you weren't looking." Despite herself, Margaret smiled. "Thank you." "You're welcome." She wore them the next day, and they fit perfectly. When she thanked Caleb again, he just nodded and went back to work. But she caught him watching her later with an expression that made something warm bloom in her chest. The following week brought the first real blizzard of winter. It started in the afternoon, a few innocent flakes that quickly became a white wall of wind and snow. By evening, the world had disappeared behind a curtain of white. Margaret and the children huddled in the bunkhouse, listening to the wind howl. The stove was going strong, but coal seeped in through every crack. Outside, the world was invisible. Around 8 o'clock, there was a pounding on the door. Margaret opened it to find Caleb standing there, covered in snow, his face red from cold. "Storm's getting worse," he shouted over the wind. "You need to come to the main house. This building won't hold if the wind gets much stronger." Margaret didn't argue. She bundled the children in every piece of clothing they owned and followed Caleb through the blinding snow. The distance between buildings was maybe 50 yards, but it felt like miles. The wind tried to tear them apart. Snow stung her face like thrown sand. Caleb kept one hand on her arm, guiding her forward. With the other, he carried Jonah, the baby's face pressed against his shoulder. Miguel appeared out of the white, carrying Ruth, who was crying from fear and cold. They stumbled into the main house like sailors reaching shore after a storm. Caleb slammed the door against the wind, and they all stood there dripping and shaking. "That was terrifying," Ruth said, her voice small. "You're safe now." Caleb set Jonah down gently. "All of you, storm can't touch you in here." The house was warm and solid, stone walls 3 feet thick, roof made to withstand Montana winters. A fire roared in the massive stone fireplace in the main room. "You'll stay here tonight," Caleb said. "All of you. Margaret, you and the baby can take my room. Samuel, you're with Miguel in the spare room. Girls, there's a settle by the fire that pulls out into a bed." "Where will you sleep?" Margaret asked. "I'll make do." They spent the evening gathered around the fire. Miguel told stories about his childhood in Mexico, about deserts and mountains, and a grandmother who could predict the weather by tasting the wind. The children listened with wide eyes, even Samuel forgetting to look troubled for a while. Around 10, Caleb sent the children to bed. Miguel took Samuel off to the spare room. Ruth and Lily climbed into the settle bed already half asleep. Margaret carried Jonah to Caleb's room. It was sparse, a bed, a dresser, a chair, a window that looked out at the invisible mountains. The bed was neatly made with rough wool blankets. On the dresser sat a photograph in a simple frame, the same photograph she'd seen at the bottom of the trunk. Anna and a younger Caleb, her hand on her swollen belly, his hand on her shoulder. Margaret looked away, feeling like an intruder. She settled Jonah in the middle of the bed and lay down beside him, still fully clothed. Outside, the wind screamed and threw snow against the windows like thrown gravel. She must have dozed because she woke to the sound of the door opening. Caleb stood silhouetted in the doorway, backlit by the fire in the main room. "Sorry," he said quietly. "Didn't mean to wake you. Just checking you had enough blankets." "We're fine." He nodded but didn't leave. Just stood there looking at her in the dim light. "Margaret," he said finally, "there's something I need to tell you." She sat up carefully, not wanting to disturb Jonah. "What is it?" "Morrison came by yesterday, while you were in town, getting supplies with Miguel." Cold that had nothing to do with the storm settled in Margaret's stomach. "What did he want?" "He had papers, legal papers. He's claiming that your arrangement here is illegal, that you're living with me without proper documentation, without marriage." "But I'm your employee." "He says we can't prove that. Says without a contract, without wages being paid, and recorded it looks like—" Caleb stopped, his jaw working. "Like I'm your mistress." "Yes." Margaret's hands clenched in the blankets. "What does he want?" "Same thing he's always wanted, my land. Specifically the North Pasture. He says if I sell it to him, he'll drop the whole thing, leave you alone. And if you don't," Caleb's face was grim, "he says he'll bring it before the territorial judge. Says you'll be charged with cohabitation and moral turpitude. That you could lose the children." The world seemed to stop. Margaret couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The only sound was the wind and her heart hammering against her ribs. "He can't do that," she whispered. "He's the deputy. He can make things very difficult." "Then sell him the land." "No." "Caleb, if it means keeping my children." "No," his voice was hard. "I won't let him win, and I won't let him take your children." "Then what do we do?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. The wind howled, the fire crackled, and when he spoke, his voice was careful, measured like he was testing each word before releasing it. "We could make it legal. The arrangement, I mean." Margaret's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we could get married, for real, on paper. It would give you legal standing. Morrison couldn't touch you then." "You don't want to marry me." "I don't want you to lose your children." Caleb stepped into the room closer to the bed, but still keeping his distance. "Thomas wanted you here. Wanted this house to have life in it again. Maybe this is what he meant all along. A marriage of convenience. A marriage of survival." Caleb's eyes met hers in the dim light. "I'm not asking you to love me, Margaret. I'm not even asking you to want this. I'm just asking if you'll let me help you. Margaret looked at her sleeping son, thought of Samuel and Ruth and Lily in the next room, thought of everything she'd endured to keep them safe and together. Why would you do this? She asked. You barely know me. I know enough. I know you work harder than any man I've ever hired. I know you love your children more than life. I know you're brave and strong, and you deserve better than to be chased and judged and made to feel ashamed. But marriage, why, doesn't have to mean what you think it means. We can keep separate rooms, separate lives. It'll just be on paper. Protection, nothing more. Unless Margaret thought it becomes something more. The thought came unbidden and she pushed it away. This was about survival, about keeping her children. Nothing else mattered. I need time to think, she said. Of course, Caleb moved toward the door. But Margaret Morrison gave me 3 days. After that, he's filing charges. He left, closing the door softly behind him. Margaret lay back down, staring at the ceiling. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, her mind whirled with questions and fears and the terrifying possibility of hope. Marriage to Caleb Thornton, a man she'd known for barely 6 weeks, a man who'd shown her more kindness than she deserved, a man who was willing to tie himself legally to a woman with 4 children and a past full of shadows, asking nothing in return except the chance to help. It was insane. It was impossible. It was the only option she had. The storm lasted 3 days. For 3 days, they were trapped in the house together. The children played games and read books and helped with small chores. Miguel taught Samuel to carve wood. Caleb showed Ruth how to braid leather. Lily followed everyone around, asking endless questions. And Margaret watched it all, watched her children bloom under the attention, watched them laugh and feel safe, and she knew what her answer had to be. On the 3rd evening after the children were asleep, she found Caleb sitting by the fire whittling a piece of wood. He looked up when she approached. Yes, she said simply. Caleb's hands stilled on the wood. You're sure? I'm sure, but I have conditions. Name them. First, the children come first, always. In any decision, any choice, they're the priority. Agreed. Second, if you change your mind, if you decide this was a mistake, you tell me. You don't just let resentment build. You tell me and we figure out what to do. I won't change my mind. You might, and I need to know you'll be honest if you do. Caleb nodded slowly. All right, anything else? Margaret took a breath. Third, I need you to promise you won't expect me to be a real wife. Not in that way. Not unless, she faltered, heat rising in her cheeks. Not unless you want it, Caleb finished quietly. I understand, and I promise. Relief flooded through her. Then yes, I'll marry you. Caleb stood. For a moment he just looked at her, then he held out his hand. Partners then, in survival. Margaret took his hand. His grip was warm and calloused and steady. Partners, she agreed. They rode to town the next morning, just the 2 of them. Miguel stayed with the children. The sky was clear and bright after the storm the world blanketed in fresh snow that sparkled like diamonds. Judge Wilson's office was above the general store. They climbed the narrow stairs and knocked on his door. The judge was a stern-looking man in his 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes. He looked between them with undisguised surprise. Caleb Thornton, this is unexpected. What can I do for you? We're here to get married. Judge Wilson's eyebrows rose. Married, to Mrs. Ashford, I presume. Yes, sir. This is rather sudden. We don't want a ceremony, just the legal paperwork. Judge Wilson leaned back in his chair, studying them. You understand this is binding, that marriage is a serious commitment. We understand, Margaret said, and you are both entering into this of your own free will. No coercion. Our own free will, Caleb confirmed. Judge Wilson pulled out a heavy book and opened it to a blank page. Very well. Do you have witnesses? Miguel Rodriguez and Doc Harris are downstairs waiting. Then let's proceed. It took less than 15 minutes. Miguel and Doc Harris came up and stood as witnesses. Judge Wilson asked the required questions. Caleb and Margaret gave the required answers. They signed the book. And just like that, they were married. Standing on the stairs afterward, Margaret felt oddly disconnected from her own body. She was married to a man she'd met 6 weeks ago, a man she barely knew, a man who'd just saved her and her children. Mrs. Thornton, Caleb said, and it took Margaret a moment to realize he was talking to her. Yes. He pulled something from his pocket, a ring. Silver simple with a small stone that might have been sapphire or might have been blue glass. It was my mother's, he said. People will expect to see a ring. Margaret held out her hand. It was shaking slightly. Caleb slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Thank you, she whispered. Caleb nodded. Then hesitantly, he lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles. It was brief, formal, the kind of gesture a gentleman makes to a lady, but it made Margaret's heart skip nonetheless. They were halfway back to the ranch when they saw the rider approaching. Deputy Morrison, his badge glinting in the sun. He pulled up beside them, his smile broad and false. Well, well, if it isn't Mr. Thornton and Mrs. Ashford, out for a morning ride. Mrs. Thornton, Caleb corrected. We were just married. Morrison's smile froze. Married when, this morning, Judge Wilson performed the ceremony. How inconvenient, Morrison's eyes narrowed. And I suppose you think this solves everything. It's legal and binding. Your complaint is invalid. Or is this just a marriage of convenience designed to circumvent the law? It's a marriage, Margaret said, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. Legal in every way. You have no grounds for complaint. Morrison's horse shifted beneath him, sensing his rider's tension. We'll see about that. Judge Wilson may have married you, but there are other authorities. Territorial law, federal law. If I find evidence this marriage is fraudulent, you won't, Caleb interrupted, because it's not. Time will tell. Morrison tipped his hat, his smile razor sharp. Congratulations on your nuptials, Mr. and Mrs. Thornton. I'm sure you'll be very happy together. He rode off, leaving them in the snow. Margaret looked at Caleb. He's not going to let this go. No, he's not. What will he do? I don't know, but whatever it is, we'll face it together. He clicked to the horses and they continued toward home, toward the ranch that was now legally half hers, toward the children who were waiting, toward a future neither of them had planned, but both of them needed. Margaret looked down at the ring on her finger. It caught the sunlight and threw back blue sparks. Mrs. Thornton, she thought. Margaret Thornton. It felt strange, wrong and right at the same time, but it felt safer than she'd felt in years. The first week of marriage was strange in ways Margaret hadn't anticipated. Nothing changed, and everything changed all at once. She still slept in the bunkhouse with the children still woke before dawn to milk the cows and feed the chickens. Still cooked and cleaned and mended and worked until her hands were raw. But now, when she walked into town with Caleb to buy supplies, people looked at her differently. The whispers were still there, but they had a different quality now, confusion instead of condemnation, uncertainty instead of smug judgment. It had been nearly 2 months since that November day at the train station. 2 months since Thomas's death. Mrs. McAllister refused to serve her at the general store, but her husband overruled her with a curt nod to Caleb. Reverend Whitfield stopped by the ranch 3 days after the wedding, ostensibly to offer congratulations, but really to assess whether the marriage was legitimate. Margaret served him coffee at the kitchen table, while Caleb stood by the stove, arms crossed, saying nothing. This is quite sudden, the Reverend said, his tone carefully neutral. I don't recall any courtship. We didn't see the need for a long engagement, Margaret replied. The circumstances were clear enough. In what circumstances would those be? I needed protection. Caleb offered marriage. We both went into it with clear eyes. Reverend Whitfield's gaze moved between them. Marriage is more than a legal contract, Mrs. Thornton. It's a sacred bond before God. I'm aware of that, Reverend. Are you? Because from the outside, this looks very much like a marriage of convenience designed to avoid scandal. Caleb's voice cut through the room like a knife. What it looks like and what it is are two different things. Margaret is my wife. That's all anyone needs to know. The Reverend set down his coffee cup. I hope you're right, Caleb, for both your sakes. But you should know that Deputy Morrison has been asking questions, making inquiries about the legitimacy of your marriage. Let him ask, Caleb said flatly. We've done nothing wrong. After the Reverend left, Margaret stood at the window watching him drive away. He doesn't believe us. Doesn't matter what he believes. We're legally married, that's fact. Morrison won't stop, you know that. Caleb came to stand beside her. I know, but Morrison's been trying to get my land for 5 years. This is just his latest attempt. He'll wear himself out eventually. Margaret wanted to believe that, but she'd seen the look in Morrison's eyes, the calculating gleam of a man who'd found a weakness and intended to exploit it. That night, lying in bed with Jonah warm against her side, she thought about the marriage, about the ring on her finger that caught moonlight through the window, about the way Caleb had looked at her that morning when she'd burned the porridge, exasperated, but not angry, almost fond. This was supposed to be simple, a legal arrangement, protection on paper. So why did her heart beat faster when he walked into a room? Why did she find herself watching him work, noticing the way his shoulders moved beneath his shirt, the careful precision of his hands? She pushed the thoughts away and closed her eyes, willing sleep to come. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Margaret was hanging laundry when she heard the wagon approaching. Two women, both around her age, both dressed in good wool coats and bonnets. The taller one climbed down first, smiling warmly. "Mrs. Thornton, I'm Sarah Jenkins. This is my sister, Emma Walsh. We heard about your marriage and wanted to welcome you properly to Silver Creek." Margaret wiped her damp hands on her apron, suspicious of this sudden friendliness. "That's kind of you." "We brought some things," Emma said, gesturing to baskets in the wagon bed. "Preserve some fabric, a few toys for the children. Just small tokens. I don't need charity." "It's not charity," Sarah said gently. "It's what neighbors do, what we should have done from the start instead of listening to gossip." Margaret studied them, looking for signs of deceit or mockery, but found only genuine warmth in their faces. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" she asked hesitantly. They stayed for 2 hours. Sarah and Emma were married to ranchers north of town. Both had children, both knew the harsh realities of Montana life. They talked about preserving food and treating frostbite and the best remedies for colic. They admired Ruth's sewing and praised Samuel for his help with the livestock. When they finally left, Sarah squeezed Margaret's hand. "Not everyone in Silver Creek is like Mrs. McAllister. Some of us understand that life is hard and we all do what we must to survive. You're welcome at our homes anytime." After they'd gone, Margaret stood holding the baskets they'd left, feeling something tight in her chest loosen slightly. Maybe not everyone was against her. Maybe there was room here for a fresh start after all, but that fragile hope shattered 3 days later. It was a Tuesday morning, cold and clear. Margaret was in the barn helping Miguel repair a broken harness when Caleb came striding in his face like thunder. "Margaret, house, now." She'd never heard that tone from him before. She followed him across the yard, her heart hammering. Inside, a man sat at the kitchen table. He was perhaps 50, with steel gray hair and a marshal's badge pinned to his vest. His eyes were hard and assessing. "Mrs. Thornton," Caleb said tightly, "this is U.S. Marshal Garrett. He has some questions for you." The marshal stood. "Ma'am, I apologize for the intrusion. I've received a complaint regarding your marriage to Mr. Thornton. I need to verify some information." "What kind of complaint?" "Deputy Morrison has filed paperwork claiming your marriage is fraudulent, that you married Mr. Thornton under false pretenses." Margaret's legs went weak. She gripped the back of a chair. "That's not true." "I'm sure it's not, ma'am, but I still need to ask some questions." The marshal pulled out a small notebook. "How long did you know Mr. Thornton before you married him?" 6 weeks. "And you came here as a mail-order bride for his brother?" "Yes." "But his brother died before you arrived?" "Yes." The marshal made notes. "And when his brother died, Mr. Thornton offered you employment?" "He did." "What kind of employment?" "Household work, cooking, cleaning, general ranch work." "And he paid you for this work?" Margaret hesitated. This was the trap. She could see it clearly. Not in wages, in room and board. "So no documented payment?" "No." The marshal's expression remained neutral, but Margaret could see where this was going. "And you lived on the property in close quarters with Mr. Thornton?" "I lived in the bunkhouse with my children. Mr. Thornton lived in the main house." "But you were alone together frequently." "Marshal," Caleb interrupted, his voice hard, "what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Thornton. I'm gathering facts. Deputy Morrison claims that Mrs. Thornton has been living as your mistress and that the marriage was arranged only after he threatened legal action. Is that true?" "No," Caleb said flatly. "Then why did you marry her?" Silence filled the kitchen. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of everything balanced on Caleb's answer. Because I wanted to, Caleb said finally, because she's a good woman who deserved better than people's judgment. Because Thomas wanted her here, and I owe my brother that much. And because he stopped, his jaw working. Because, the marshal prompted, because this house has been empty for 10 years, dead, and she brought it back to life. The marshal studied Caleb for a long moment. Then he turned to Margaret. Mrs. Thornton, did anyone coerce you into this marriage? No. Did you marry Mr. Thornton for financial gain or to avoid legal consequences? I married him for protection, Margaret said honestly. My children and I had nowhere else to go, but I came to care for him, to respect him. This isn't a sham marriage, it's real. Was it real? Even as she said the words, Margaret wondered if they were true. She respected Caleb certainly, was grateful to him. But caring, was that what this feeling was? This constant awareness of him, this need to know he was safe and well? The marshal closed his notebook. I'll need to verify some things. Talk to other people who know you both. If everything checks out, I'll file a report clearing you of any wrongdoing. But if I find evidence of fraud, he left the threat hanging. After he left, Margaret sank into a chair. Her hands were shaking. He believes Morrison, she said. He's doing his well, investigating a complaint. And when he investigates, what will he find? That we married after 6 weeks. That we sleep in separate buildings. That we barely know each other. We know each other well enough. Do we? Margaret looked up at him. What's my middle name? When is my birthday? What was my mother's name? Caleb frowned. I don't. Exactly, we don't know those things because this isn't a real marriage. It's exactly what Morrison says it is. A legal arrangement. That doesn't make it fraud. It does if we can't prove otherwise. Caleb pulled out a chair and sat across from her. Then we prove it. We learn those things. We make this look like what a marriage should look like. How? I don't know, but we figure it out. Together. That evening, after the children were asleep, Caleb came to the bunkhouse. He knocked softly and Margaret opened the door, surprised to see him there. Can I come in? She stepped aside. He entered, looking around the small space he'd given her that first night. It looked different now. Cleaner, more organized, with small touches that made it feel like home. Ruth's doll on the shelf. Samuel's carved animals lined up on the windowsill. Lily's drawings pinned to the wall. I've been thinking, Caleb said, about what you said, about not knowing each other. Caleb, I didn't mean. You were right. If we're going to convince people this marriage is real, we need to know each other better. He paused. So tell me, what is your middle name? Margaret blinked. Rose. Margaret Rose Ashford. Thornton now. Margaret Rose, Caleb repeated, like he was testing the sound of it. Pretty. It was my grandmother's name. My mother's mother. She died before I was born. When's your birthday? April 15th. Mine's June 3rd. Caleb sat in one of the chairs by the stove. My middle name is James, after my father, though he didn't deserve the honor. Margaret sat across from him. Why not? He was a drunk and a bully. Beat my mother until the day she died. Beat me and Thomas too when he was in his cups. Caleb's voice was matter of fact, like he was recounting someone else's story. He died when I was 16, fell off his horse and broke his neck. Nobody mourned him much. I'm sorry. Don't be. World's better without men like him in it. Caleb leaned forward. Your turn. Tell me something about yourself. Something real. Margaret thought for a moment. I wanted to be a teacher. Before I married Henry, I mean. I loved reading, loved learning. I thought I might teach in a school somewhere, but then, she shrugged. Life had different plans. It's not too late. You could still teach. Who would I teach? The children in town. Half of them can barely read. Or teach here. Ruth and Samuel and Lily. Hell, teach me if you want. I never learned more than basic reading and arithmetic. The idea surprised her. You'd want that. Why not never too old to learn? They talked until late, trading small pieces of themselves. Favorite foods and least favorite chores. Memories of childhood and dreams for the future. Nothing earth-shattering, but each small revelation felt like building something. A foundation, maybe. Or a bridge between two lonely people trying to find solid ground. When Caleb finally left, Margaret lay in bed feeling strange and unsettled. She was learning him, learning the way he rubbed his jaw when he was thinking, the way his eyes softened when he talked about Thomas, the scar on his forearm from a barbed wire fence when he was 12. And with each small piece of knowledge, the marriage felt less like a legal arrangement and more like something real. The marshal returned a week later. He talked to Miguel, who swore that Caleb and Margaret were devoted to each other. To Doc Harris, who said he'd never seen a man look at a woman the way Caleb looked at Margaret. To Sarah and Emma, who testified that Margaret ran a good household and clearly cared for her husband. Everything seems to be in order, the marshal said, his tone suggesting he wasn't entirely convinced but couldn't prove otherwise. I'll file my report accordingly, but Mrs. Thornton, I'd advise you to be careful. Deputy Morrison is persistent. If he finds any evidence that this marriage is fraudulent, he won't hesitate to act. After the marshal left, Margaret felt the tension drain from her body, leaving her weak and shaking. The immediate threat had passed, but Morrison was still out there, still waiting for them to slip up. That night, a knock came at the bunkhouse door near midnight. Margaret opened it to find Caleb standing there, snow dusting his shoulders. Something's happened, he said. Miguel found tracks. Someone's been watching the ranch. Cold fear gripped her. Morrison. Don't know, but whoever it was, they were watching the bunkhouse and the main house, like they were trying to see how we lived, where we slept. He's gathering evidence. Looks like it. Caleb's jaw was tight. Margaret, I think you and the children need to move into the main house. What? For appearances, if Morrison's watching, if he's trying to prove we're not really married, we need to show otherwise. Married couples don't live in separate buildings. Margaret's heart hammered. Caleb, I can't. You'll have your own room, I swear it, but we need to look like a real family, for the children's sake. The children. Always the children. That was what mattered. That was what everything came back to. All right, she said quietly. We'll move. They relocated the next day. Margaret and the children took the 2 spare bedrooms upstairs. Caleb kept his room on the ground floor. It was all proper, all respectable, but it felt different living under the same roof. Hearing Caleb move around downstairs in the evening, passing him in the hallway, sharing meals at the same table every day instead of just occasionally. Ruth bloomed under the attention. She followed Caleb around, asking endless questions about the ranch, about the animals, about how things worked. He answered patiently, sometimes even smiling at her enthusiasm. Samuel grew more confident working alongside Miguel and Caleb, learning to be a man in a way he'd never had the chance to with Henry. Even Lily warmed to Caleb, climbing into his lap one evening and falling asleep there while he read the newspaper. He'd looked startled, unsure what to do, until Margaret had gently lifted the sleeping child and carried her upstairs. She likes you, Margaret had said. She's a good kid. They all are. They didn't have much of a father before. Henry he wasn't kind to them. Caleb's expression had darkened. Then they deserve better now. The weeks passed, winter deepened, snow piled high against the buildings. The world contracted to the ranch, to the work, to the small circle of warmth they'd created. And somewhere in those weeks, something shifted. Margaret couldn't pinpoint the exact moment. Maybe it was the night she found Caleb in the barn at 2 a.m. delivering a difficult calf, his hands gentle and sure as he worked to save both mother and baby. Maybe it was the morning he taught Ruth to milk a cow, his voice patient and encouraging. Maybe it was the afternoon she looked up from kneading bread to find him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. Whenever it happened, Margaret realized with a start that she was falling for her husband. Not the convenient arrangement kind of feeling, not gratitude or respect or companionship. Real feeling, the kind that made her heart race when he smiled. The kind that made her aware of every inch of space between them. The kind that made her lie awake at night, thinking about what it would be like if this marriage was real in every way, not just on paper. It terrified her. One evening in late February, after the children were in bed, Margaret sat by the fire mending one of Caleb's shirts. He sat across from her, working on a piece of leather, his hands moving with practiced ease. Margaret, he said suddenly, there's something I need to tell you. She looked up, needle paused mid-stitch. What is it? Morrison came by today while you were in town with the children. Ice formed in her stomach. What did he want? He had more questions. About our marriage. About whether we share a room. Caleb's jaw tightened. I told him it was none of his damn business. But he said he'd be watching. Said if he found any proof this marriage was a sham, He'd bring charges not just against you, but against me too. Fraud, conspiracy. What does that mean? It means he could try to take the ranch, could try to have us both arrested. Caleb set down the leather and leaned forward. Margaret, I won't let that happen. But we need to be more careful. Need to make sure there's no question about our marriage being legitimate. How Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said carefully, people talk, they say things about married couples, about what they do and don't do. Heat flooded Margaret's face. Caleb, I'm not suggesting anything, he said quickly. I promised you I wouldn't expect that. And I meant it. But Morrison's smart. He'll be looking for proof we're not really married. And one of the ways people judge that is intimacy, Margaret finished quietly. Yes. They sat in uncomfortable silence. The fire crackled. Outside, wind moaned around the eaves. What do you want me to do? Margaret asked finally. I don't know. Caleb ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. I just wanted you to know what we're up against. So you're not surprised if Morrison asks invasive questions or if people start speculating. Margaret set aside her mending. Caleb, if you're having second thoughts about this marriage, if you want to end it. No, his voice was sharp. That's not what I'm saying at all. Then what are you saying? He stood abruptly and paced to the window. I'm saying I don't know how to protect you from this. I thought getting married would solve the problem. But Morrison just keeps pushing, keeps looking for cracks, and I don't know how to stop him. Margaret rose and went to stand beside him. Outside, the snow glowed blue-white under moonlight. The mountains were dark shadows against a darker sky. We keep doing what we're doing, she said. We live our lives, we raise the children, we work the ranch, and we don't give Morrison anything to use against us. And if that's not enough, then we'll face whatever comes together. Caleb turned to look at her. They were standing very close, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, close enough to feel the heat of his body. Margaret, he said softly, when this started, when I asked you to marry me, it was just about protection, just a legal arrangement. Her heart was pounding. I know. But somewhere along the way, it became more than that, for me anyway. He lifted his hand, hesitated, then gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. You've become important to me. You and the children. This house feels like a home again, and I need you to know that even if Morrison disappeared tomorrow, even if there was no threat at all, I'd still want you here. Margaret couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only stand there feeling the whispered touch of his fingers against her temple, seeing the truth in his eyes. I care for you too, she whispered. Do you, Bahi? Yes. The word came out barely audible. More than I should, more than is safe. Why isn't it safe? Because I don't know how to trust this, how to believe it won't be taken away. Everything good in my life has been taken away. Caleb's hand cupped her cheek. I'm not going anywhere, Margaret, and I won't let anyone take you or the children away. I swear it. Then he kissed her. It was gentle, tentative, nothing like the rough demands Henry used to make. Caleb kissed her like she was precious, like she was something to be treasured rather than claimed. When they pulled apart, Margaret's eyes were wet with tears. I'm sorry, Caleb said immediately. I shouldn't have. No. She put her fingers over his lips. Don't apologize. I wanted you to. They stood there in the firelight, holding each other, while outside the winter wind sang through the mountains and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Margaret felt something that might have been happiness, might have been hope, might have been love. But even as she let herself feel it, let herself believe in the possibility of something good, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered a warning. Nothing good lasts. Not for women like you. Not for people who've been marked by scandal and shame. And Morrison was still out there waiting and watching, looking for any weakness he could exploit. The fragile peace wouldn't last. It never did. The summons came on a bitter March morning when the world was caught between winter and spring, frozen mud, and patches of snow wind that couldn't decide whether to howl or whisper. Caleb brought it in from town, his face grim. Margaret saw the paper in his hand, and her stomach dropped. What is it? He handed it to her without a word. Official territorial court document, heavy paper with an embossed seal. Margaret's hands shook as she read. Margaret Thornton and Caleb Thornton were hereby summoned to appear before Judge Harrison on March 28th to answer charges of marriage fraud, moral turpitude, and conspiracy to deceive territorial authorities. Morrison, she breathed. He's been building a case, gathering witnesses. Doc Harris warned me yesterday. Says Morrison's been asking questions all over town, promising favors to anyone who'll testify against us. Margaret sank into a chair. The paper crumpled in her grip. What will happen? Trial, public hearing. They'll examine our marriage, question us separately, talk to anyone who knows us. Caleb's voice was tight. If they find the marriage fraudulent, they can annul it, fine us, even jail time for fraud. And the children? Silence. That was answer enough. Margaret looked up at him, fear like ice in her veins. They could take them away. I won't let that happen. You might not have a choice. Caleb crossed to her, knelt down so they were eye level. Listen to me. We're going to fight this. We're going to show everyone that our marriage is real and legal and exactly what it should be. Morrison wants my land, but he's not going to get it. And he's sure as hell not getting your children. How can you be so sure? Because I've got something Morrison doesn't have. What's that? The truth. Caleb took her hands in his. Margaret, this marriage might have started as an arrangement, but it's become real. You know it has. I know it has. And that's what we're going to prove. That night, lying in her bed with Jonah asleep beside her, Margaret stared at the ceiling and tried not to think about what losing would mean. Tried not to imagine her children torn from her arms, placed with strangers, or sent to an orphanage. Tried not to remember the taste of Caleb's kiss. The warmth of his arms, the brief happiness she'd allowed herself to feel. All of it could be stripped away in one court proceeding. She'd survived Henry's abuse, survived his death in the town's judgment, survived the desperate journey to Montana in the harsh winter, but losing her children. She wouldn't survive that. The days before the trial crawled past like wounded things. Margaret worked mechanically, barely tasting food, barely sleeping. The children sensed something was wrong. Ruth grew quiet and clingy. Samuel's jaw developed the same tight set Caleb's had. Even Lily stopped chattering, her thumb finding its way back to her mouth. Caleb brought home a lawyer from Helena. His name was Morrison, ironically enough, though no relation to the deputy. Morrison, the lawyer, was thin and precise with spectacles that caught the light. The case against you is circumstantial, but problematic, he said, spreading papers across the kitchen table. Deputy Morrison has 3 witnesses prepared to testify that your marriage appears fraudulent. Mrs. McAllister will say she's never seen you behave affectionately toward each other. A ranch hand named Travis Kemp claims he saw Mrs. Thornton arrive and heard you, Mr. Thornton, tell her she'd have to leave. Travis Kemp was fired 2 years ago for stealing, Miguel interjected from his place by the stove. He is a liar and a drunk. Nevertheless, his testimony will carry weight. And then there's the matter of your living arrangements. The lawyer looked between them. You were married in November. It's now March. Yet neighbors report seeing lamplight in separate buildings at night, seeing you maintain separate sleeping quarters. We have children, Margaret said. They needed their own space. I understand, but to an outside observer, it suggests you're not truly living as man and wife. Caleb's hand found Margaret's under the table. His grip was warm and steady. What do we need to do? Tell your story honestly. Show the progression of your relationship. Demonstrate that while the marriage may have begun as an arrangement, it's become genuine. The lawyer paused. And hope the judge believes you. The night before the trial, Margaret couldn't sleep. She rose quietly and went downstairs, thinking to make tea, to do something with her restless hands. Caleb was already there, sitting at the table in the dark. He looked up when she entered. Couldn't sleep either, he asked. No. Margaret sat across from him. Moonlight through the window painted everything silver in shadow. I'm scared, she admitted. So am I. What if we lose? We won't. But if we do, Margaret, Caleb reached across the table, took her hand. If we lose, we fight. We appeal. We run if we have to. But I'm not letting them take your children. I'm not letting them destroy what we've built here. Why? The question burst out of her. Why do you care so much? You barely knew us when we arrived. You didn't want us here. So why risk everything for us now? Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, you want to know why I really asked you to marry me? You said it was to protect me, to honor Thomas. That was part of it. But there was another reason. He stood paced to the window. When Anna died, when I lost her and our daughter both in one night, something in me died too. I went through the motions of living, but I wasn't really alive. Thomas tried to pull me out of it, but I wouldn't let him. I was too buried in grief. He turned to face her. Then you showed up. You and 4 kids and enough courage to shame a grown man. You didn't ask for charity or pity. You asked for a chance to work, to prove yourself. And every day since you've done exactly that. You've worked harder than any hired hand I've ever had. You've brought life back to this house, given me a reason to wake up in the morning that isn't just duty or habit. Margaret's eyes burned with tears. You made me remember what it feels like to be alive, Caleb said softly. To want things, to hope for things. So no, I didn't barely know you when I asked you to marry me. I knew you well enough. I knew you were strong and brave and everything this place needed. Everything I needed. Margaret stood close to him. They met in the middle of the kitchen in the moonlight and shadows. I was so afraid to feel anything for you, she whispered. Afraid it would be taken away like everything else. I know, but I do feel something, more than gratitude or respect, more than I know how to name. Margaret, she kissed him. Not gentle this time, not tentative. She kissed him like a woman who'd finally stopped being afraid, who'd finally let herself want something. Caleb's arms came around her, pulling her close. For a long moment they stood there holding each other, 2 broken people who'd somehow found a way to be whole together. When they finally pulled apart, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever the judge decides, I want you to know something. What? I love you, I'm in love with you, not because of convenience or arrangement or anything practical, just because of who you are. The tears spilled over then. I love you too. They went upstairs together that night, not to separate rooms, but to Caleb's room, the one he'd slept in alone for 10 years. And when they made love, it was gentle and slow, and filled with everything they couldn't say in words. Afterward, lying in his arms with her head on his chest, Margaret felt something settle inside her. Peace, maybe, or just the certainty that whatever came, they would face it together. The courthouse was packed. It seemed the entire town had turned out for the spectacle. Margaret sat at the front table with Caleb and their lawyer, trying not to look at the crowd behind her, trying not to see the eager faces waiting for scandal, the whispers and pointed fingers. Judge Harrison was exactly as she'd pictured him, severe, gray-haired with eyes that missed nothing. He called the court to order with a sharp rap of his gavel. Deputy Morrison stood to present his case. He was confident, smiling, laying out his accusations with the precision of a man who'd practiced this speech. Your Honor, this is a simple case of fraud. Mrs. Ashford, as she was, then came to Montana under false pretenses. When her intended husband died, she insinuated herself into Mr. Thornton's household. When threatened with legal action, she convinced him to marry her to avoid scandal. This marriage is a sham designed to circumvent territorial law and acquire property rights she has no legitimate claim to. He called his first witness. Mrs. McAllister took the stand, her face pinched with righteousness. Have you observed Mr. and Mrs. Thornton together? Morrison asked. I have. In church, in town. And I can tell you, Your Honor, they don't behave like a married couple. No affection, no tenderness. They barely look at each other. And what would you say their relationship appears to be? A business arrangement at best. At worst, well, Mrs. McAllister's implication hung heavy in the air. Their lawyer cross-examined, but Mrs. McAllister stuck to her story. She'd seen no evidence of real marriage, only cold formality. Next came Travis Kemp. He was exactly as Miguel had described, unshaven and shifty-eyed, his clothes smelling of whiskey. Mr. Kemp, Morrison said, tell the court what you witnessed in November. I was passing by the Thornton Ranch looking for work when I saw a woman and some kids get off a wagon. Heard Mr. Thornton tell her she'd have to leave, that he didn't want her there. Heard him say it plain as day. And did she leave? No, sir. She stayed. And a few weeks later they were married. Mighty convenient, if you ask me. Caleb's lawyer stood. Mr. Kemp, you say you were looking for work. Did you find any not at Thornton's place? Why not? Kemp shifted. He said he didn't need anyone. Is it true you were fired from the Thornton Ranch 2 years ago for theft? That was never proven. But you were fired. Yes. And you've been heard in town saying you'd like to see Caleb Thornton lose his land. Isn't that true? I might have said something like that. Man treated me unfairly. So you have motive to lie. I ain't lying. I saw what I saw. The morning dragged on. More witnesses, more testimonies. Some supportive like Miguel and Doc Harris, who spoke passionately about the genuine affection they'd witnessed. Some neutral, some clearly hostile. Then Morrison called he his final witness, and Margaret's blood turned to ice. The prosecution calls Mrs. Eleanor Hayes of Lawrence, Kansas. An older woman rose from the back of the courtroom. Margaret recognized her immediately. Mrs. Hayes had been their neighbor in Kansas, had been one of the first to turn against Margaret after Henry died. Mrs. Hayes took the stand, her face sympathetic in a way that made Margaret's skin crawl. Mrs. Hayes, Morrison said smoothly, you knew Mrs. Thornton in Kansas, didn't you? I did. She was my neighbor for 8 years. Tell the court about her husband's death. Henry Ashford died in a wagon accident, drove drunk off the road one night and broke his neck. At least, that's what we were told. You had doubts. We all did. Henry was a drinker, yes, but he'd driven that road drunk 100 times. And Margaret? Mrs. Hayes paused delicately. She stood to inherit. Not much, but enough to get by. And the very day after the funeral, she started selling everything. The house, the furniture, everything. Like she couldn't wait to leave. Did she seem grief-stricken? Not that I could see. She seemed relieved. Objection, their Bashir shouted. Speculation. Sustained, Judge Harrison said. Hayes, stick to what you observed, not what you felt. But the damage was done. Margaret could feel the crowd behind her, shifting, murmuring. Could feel judgment settling over the room like smoke. Morrison smiled. No further questions. Their lawyer tried to salvage it. Mrs. Hayes, did you ever witness Mrs. Ashford harm her husband? No. Did anyone? Not that I know of. So your suspicions are based purely on how she behaved after his death? Well, yes, but... And isn't it possible she was relieved because her husband was an abusive drunk? I never saw him abuse her. Did you look? Did you ask? Or did you just assume? Mrs. Hayes's face flushed. I assumed nothing. I'm simply reporting what I saw. But doubt had entered her testimony, small cracks in her certainty. The lawyer pressed harder until Mrs. Hayes admitted she'd never actually seen anything inappropriate, had only heard rumors and formed opinions. It was Margaret's turn next. She took the stand with trembling legs, her hands gripping the rail to keep them steady. Morrison approached like a wolf scenting blood. Mrs. Thornton, or should I call you Mrs. Ashford? It's hard to keep track of your various names. Mrs. Thornton is fine. How convenient that your last husband died and left you free to marry again. Objection, their lawyer barked. The witness is not on trial for her first husband's death. Sustained. Deputy Morrison, get to your point. Morrison smiled coldly. Mrs. Thornton, you married Mr. Thornton after knowing him for 6 weeks. True? Yes. And you married him because he offered protection from legal consequences. I married him because I needed help and he offered it. Help, is that what you call it? You needed a home and he had one. You needed money and he had land. You needed a way to avoid scandal and he had a name. Quite the transaction. It wasn't like that. Wasn't it? Tell me, Mrs. Thornton, do you love your husband? The courtroom went silent, every eye fixed on Margaret. She looked at Caleb. He sat rigid in his chair, his face unreadable, but his eyes locked on hers. Yes, she said clearly, I love him. How convenient. And when did this love develop, before the marriage or after you needed legal protection? It grew over time, like most love does. Most love develops over years, not weeks. Sometimes it happens faster when you see someone's true character. Morrison leaned in close. Or sometimes it's manufactured to avoid prosecution. Tell me, Mrs. Thornton, where did you sleep last night? Heat flooded Margaret's face. That's none of your concern. I'm making it my concern. If this is a real marriage, if you're truly man and wife, then you should have no trouble answering. Where did you sleep? Margaret lifted her chin. In my husband's bed, where a wife belongs. Morrison's smile was triumphant. How interesting, because just 2 weeks ago, A witness observed two separate bedrooms in use. Saw you in one room with your children and Mr. Thornton in another. So which is it, Mrs. Thornton? Are you lying now or were you lying then? Our sleeping arrangements are our business, not when they're being used to defraud the territorial court. Morrison turned to the judge. Your Honor, this woman is clearly lying to protect a fraudulent marriage. She's admitted the marriage was one of convenience. She's admitted she barely knew Mr. Thornton when she married him. And now she expects us to believe she's developed genuine feelings in a matter of months. The timeline alone proves this is a sham. He returned to his seat satisfied. Their lawyer stood for redirect. Mrs. Thornton, did Mr. Thornton ever force you to marry him? No. Did he ever threaten you or coerce you in any way? Never. Oh, then why did you agree to marry him? Margaret took a breath. Because he showed me kindness when no one else would. Because he gave my children shelter when we had nowhere to go. Because he asked me what I could do, not what I'd done wrong. And because over the weeks I lived on his ranch, I saw the kind of man he was. Honorable, hardworking, kind to my children. And I thought maybe I could trust him. Maybe I could build something new. And have you built something new? Yes, we have. Not just a legal arrangement, but a real marriage, a real family. When Margaret stepped down, Caleb was called. He took the stand with the same quiet confidence he brought to everything. Morrison attacked immediately. Mr. Thornton, you were in love with your first wife, weren't you? I was. And she died 10 years ago. Yes. That's a long time to grieve, a long time to be alone. Must have been lonely. It was. Lonely enough that when a woman appeared on your doorstep desperate and vulnerable, you saw an opportunity. Caleb's jaw tightened. I saw a woman who needed help. How noble. And it had nothing to do with wanting companionship, wanting someone to cook and clean and warm your bed. I didn't ask her to do any of that. But she did it anyway. And then conveniently, when legal trouble threatened, you married her. Tell me, Mr. Thornton, do you love your wife? Caleb looked directly at Margaret. Yes, I love her. Since when? I don't know the exact moment, but sometime between her showing up with 4 kids and a suitcase and now I fell in love with her. How romantic. And if she left tomorrow, would you fight to keep her? With everything I have. Because you love her or because you need her labor? Because she's my wife. Because those children need a home. Because we've built something good here, and I'll be damned if I let you destroy it for your own petty reasons. Petty reasons, Morrison stood. Your Honor, the witness is becoming hostile. The witness is becoming honest, Caleb shot back. We all know what this is really about. You want my land. You've wanted it for years. And when I wouldn't sell, you found another way to try to take it. You're using Margaret and her children as weapons. You don't care about justice or morality. You care about money. That's a lie. Is it? Then why did you offer to drop all charges if I sold you the North Pasture? Why did you forge that telegram claiming Margaret's husband was alive? Why have you spent months harassing a woman and 4 children who've done nothing wrong? The courtroom erupted in noise. Judge Harrison's gavel cracked like thunder. Order, I will have order. When silence finally fell, the judge looked at Morrison with cold eyes. Deputy, is there truth to these accusations? Morrison's face was red. Your Honor, Mr. Thornton is obviously trying to deflect from his own crimes. That's not an answer. Did you or did you not attempt to extort land from Mr. Thornton? I made a business offer. There's no law against that. There is a law against using your position as deputy to coerce citizens. Judge Harrison shuffled his papers. I'll hear closing arguments. Morrison went first, hammering home his points about the rushed marriage, the lack of visible affection, the convenient timing. He painted Margaret as a scheming widow and Caleb as a lonely fool. Their lawyer countered with character witnesses, with Miguel's passionate defense, with Doc Harris's testimony about seeing real love between them. He pointed out Travis Kemp's dubious credibility, Mrs. McAllister's obvious bias, Mrs. Hayes's admission that she'd never witnessed abuse. Your Honor, their lawyer concluded, this is not a case of fraud. This is a case of 2 people trying to survive in a harsh world. Yes, their marriage began as an arrangement, but arrangements can become real. Convenience can become love. And everything we've heard today suggests that's exactly what happened here. Judge Harrison dismissed them, said he'd render his verdict after lunch. Those 2 hours were the longest of Margaret's life. They waited in a small room off the courthouse, not speaking, barely breathing. The children had been kept away, watched by Sarah and Emma, but Margaret felt their absence like a wound. Finally, they were called back. The courtroom was even more packed than before, people standing along the walls. Judge Harrison looked tired. He shuffled papers, adjusted his spectacles, and finally spoke. "I've reviewed all testimony and evidence. This is a complicated case. The marriage in question clearly began as an arrangement of convenience. The timeline is rushed. The circumstances are unusual." Margaret's heart sank. "However," the judge continued, "I find no evidence of actual fraud. Mrs. Thornton came to Montana in good faith, responding to a legitimate advertisement. When the advertiser died, Mr. Thornton offered employment. When that arrangement became untenable due to social pressure and legal threats, they married. While unusual, nothing about this sequence is criminal." He paused. "Furthermore, I'm troubled by Deputy Morrison's conduct throughout this investigation. His accusations appear motivated more by personal interest in acquiring Mr. Thornton's property than by genuine concern for justice. I'm therefore ruling as follows." Margaret held her breath. "The marriage of Caleb Thornton and Margaret Ashford Thornton is hereby declared legal and valid. All charges of fraud and moral turpitude are dismissed. Furthermore, Deputy Morrison, I'm recommending to the Territorial Marshal that your conduct be investigated for possible abuse of authority." The courtroom erupted, cheers and protests mixing together in a cacophony of noise. Margaret couldn't hear any of it. She could only feel Caleb's arms around her, could only hear his voice in her ear saying, "It's over, you're safe, we're safe." She collapsed against him, sobbing with relief and exhaustion and overwhelming gratitude. They'd won. The week after the trial brought changes swift and final. Deputy Morrison resigned under pressure from the Territorial Marshal's investigation. Within 3 days, he'd packed his belongings and left Silver Creek on the morning stage, his face a mask of bitter defeat. No one saw him off. The North Pasture remained part of the Thornton Ranch, but more than that changed. Mrs. McAllister appeared at the ranch on a gray Saturday morning, her face tight with the effort of swallowing pride. "Mrs. Thornton," she said stiffly, "I owe you an apology. I judged you unfairly. I hope you can forgive me." Margaret, standing in the doorway with Clara on her hip, studied the older woman, saw genuine remorse beneath the discomfort. "We all make mistakes, Mrs. McAllister. You're forgiven." The tension in Mrs. McAllister's shoulders eased. "Thank you, and if you ever need anything from the store, you're welcome, always." It was a small thing, but it was a beginning. Outside the courthouse, people mobbed them. Sarah and Emma appeared with the children. Ruth threw herself into Margaret's arms. Samuel stood tall and proud. Lily asked loudly if they could go home now. Miguel appeared grinning broadly. "I told you, boss, the truth wins." Even Reverend Whitfield approached, looking sheepish. "Mrs. Thornton, Mr. Thornton, I owe you both an apology. I judged when I should have offered grace. I hope you'll forgive me." "Already forgiven," Caleb said. Deputy Morrison slunk away, his face thunderous. Within a week, he'd resign and leave Silver Creek, his schemes finally catching up with him. The North Pasture would remain part of the Thornton Ranch, but that was later. In that moment, standing on the courthouse steps with spring sun finally breaking through winter clouds, Margaret simply held her husband and her children and let herself believe in happy endings. Spring came late to Montana that year, but when it finally arrived, it came with a rush. Snow melted into rushing creeks. Wildflowers exploded across the meadows. The world seemed determined to make up for the harsh winter with excessive beauty. At the Thornton Ranch, changes bloomed like the wildflowers. Margaret moved her things fully into Caleb's room. No more pretense of separate quarters. The children adjusted quickly, seeming to blossom with the certainty that this home was permanent, that no one would take it away. Samuel, now 11, spent his days working alongside Caleb and Miguel, learning everything about running a ranch. He was shooting up in height, his shoulders broadening, his voice beginning to crack. Sometimes Margaret looked at him and saw glimpses of the man he'd become, and her heart ached with pride. Ruth discovered a love for the horses. Caleb taught her to ride patient and encouraging, and soon she was galloping across the meadows with her hair streaming behind her, laughing with pure joy. Even shy Lily came out of her shell, following Miguel everywhere, chattering in a mixture of English and the Spanish words he taught her. Her thumb finally left her mouth for good, And Jonah, growing fast, learned to walk that spring. His first steps were toward Caleb's arms outstretched, calling Papa, in a voice that made Caleb's eyes go suspiciously bright. Papa, Margaret said softly, watching from the doorway. He called you Papa. Caleb picked up the toddler, his expression a mixture of wonder and pain and joy. Is that all right? I don't want to replace his father. His father didn't deserve the title. You do. Life settled into a rhythm sweeter than anything Margaret had known. She woke each morning in Caleb's arms, worked alongside him during the day, fell asleep each night knowing she was safe, loved home. But the greatest change came in late April, about a month after the trial. Margaret had been feeling poorly for weeks. Tired, nauseated, her body strange and unfamiliar. At first, she thought it was just the aftermath of stress from the trial. But when she missed her monthly courses, when the nausea continued, when her breast became tender and her dresses grew tight, she knew. Doc Harris confirmed it. About 2 months along, I'd say. Baby should come around Christmas. Margaret sat in his office, hands trembling. Another child. A baby. Caleb's baby. Are you all right? Doc Harris asked. You've gone pale. I'm fine, just surprised. Does Mr. Thornton know? Not yet. She told him that evening after the children were in bed. They sat on the porch watching stars emerge in the deepening blue sky. Margaret's hands twisted in her apron. Caleb, there's something I need to tell you. He looked at her concerned. What is it? Are you all right? I'm pregnant. The words hung in the air between them. Caleb's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Shock, wonder, fear, joy. A baby, he said finally. We're having a baby. Yes, Doc Harris says around Christmas. Caleb stood abruptly, paced to the porch rail, gripped it hard. Margaret watched him, her heart in her throat. Was he angry? Frightened? Did he regret this? Then he turned and she saw tears streaming down his face. Anna and I, he said, his voice thick. We wanted children so badly. We'd been trying for years when she finally got pregnant. We were so happy, so ready. And then, he didn't finish, didn't need to. Margaret rose and went to him. I'm scared too. My last pregnancy was difficult. Jonah nearly killed me. I don't know if I can. Then we'll be careful. We'll do everything right. Doc Harris will watch over you. And if anything goes wrong, if there's any danger at all, we stop. I won't lose you, Margaret. I won't. She leaned into him, felt his arms come around her. I want this baby. Our baby. I want to give you what you lost. You're not replacing anything. You're creating something new. Something beautiful. They stood there holding each other while the stars wheeled overhead and the wind whispered through the grass. The pregnancy progressed slowly. Margaret felt every day of it. The nausea finally passed around 4 months, replaced by exhaustion so profound she could barely keep her eyes open after dinner. Her belly swelled larger than it had with any of her other children. Twins maybe, Doc Harris said during one examination, or just a big baby. Either way, you need to rest more. But rest was hard to come by on a ranch. There was always work to be done. Margaret pushed herself, kept going until one day in late August, she collapsed while hanging laundry. Caleb found her unconscious in the grass, the basket of wet clothes scattered around her. He carried her to bed, sent Samuel racing for Doc Harris, and sat beside her holding her hand and praying to a God he hadn't talked to in 10 years. Doc Harris confirmed what Caleb had feared. She's pushing herself too hard. The baby's taking everything she has, and she's not resting enough to recover. If she keeps this up, we'll lose them both. Tell me what to do. Bed rest complete for the next 3 months. She's not to lift anything heavier than a spoon. She's not to work. She needs to eat, sleep, and grow that baby. Nothing else. Caleb enforced it ruthlessly. Margaret was confined to bed over her protests. Sarah and Emma came to help with the household work. Ruth took over the cooking, surprisingly capable for an 8-year-old. Samuel and Miguel handled the ranch work. And Caleb sat with her every evening, reading to her, talking with her, his hand resting on her swollen belly, feeling the baby kick. Strong kicks, he said one night. This one's a fighter. Like its mother. Like both its parents. September faded into October. Margaret grew so large she could barely move. Everything ached. Sleep was impossible. She was uncomfortable and cranky and felt like a beached whale. I hate this, she said one particularly difficult night. I hate being useless. You're growing a human being. That's not useless. It feels useless. Caleb kissed her forehead. 2 more months. You can do this. But the baby had other ideas. The labor started on a cold November morning 3 weeks earlier than expected. Margaret woke to contractions that stole her breath. Caleb, she gasped. The baby. It's coming. Everything happened quickly after that. Doc Harris arrived. Sarah and Emma came to help. Caleb was banished downstairs with the children left to pace and worry and remember another labor. Another woman, another baby that never got to draw breath. Upstairs, Margaret labored through the day and into the night. The pain was enormous, overwhelming, consuming everything. She heard herself screaming and couldn't stop. Heard Doc Harris's calm voice giving instructions. Heard Sarah's encouragement. And through it all, she thought, I can't die. I can't leave Caleb. Can't leave my children. This baby needs to live. We both need to live. Near midnight, after hours of pushing, the baby finally came. A girl. She was tiny and red and perfect, with a shock of dark hair and lungs that worked just fine, announcing her arrival with an indignant wail. A daughter, Doc Harris said, placing the baby on Margaret's chest. Small but healthy. Margaret looked down at the squalling infant and burst into tears. Relief, joy, overwhelming love. Downstairs, Caleb heard the baby's cry and dropped into a chair, his whole body shaking. Alive. They were both alive. Miguel clapped him on the shoulder. Congratulations, Papa. You want to meet your daughter. Caleb took the stairs 2 at a time, burst into the bedroom to find Margaret exhausted but smiling, holding a bundle wrapped in blankets. It's a girl, she said. We have a daughter. Caleb approached slowly, like he was afraid sudden movement might shatter the moment. He looked down at the baby's face, at her tiny features, her unfocused eyes. She's perfect, he whispered. Do you want to hold her? With shaking hands, Caleb took his daughter. She was so small, impossibly small. He'd forgotten how fragile newborns were. He held her like she was made of glass, terrified he might break her. The baby opened her eyes and looked up at him. In that moment, something in Caleb's heart that had been frozen for 10 years finally thawed completely. Hello, little one, he said softly. I'm your papa, and I promise I'm going to put Boa in there to protect you and love you every day of your life. What should we name her? Margaret asked. Caleb thought for a moment. Then Clara. After my mother. She would have loved her. Clara Thornton, Margaret smiled. Perfect. The other children met their sister the next morning. Ruth was enchanted, insisting on holding the baby immediately. Samuel looked terrified he might drop her. Lily wanted to know when Clara would be big enough to play. Jonah just stared, fascinated. This is your sister, Margaret told them, and you're going to help take care of her. Over the following weeks, the household adjusted to a new baby. Clara was a good infant, sleeping reasonably well and eating eagerly. Margaret recovered slowly but steadily. Caleb hovered like a nervous mother hen until Margaret finally told him she was fine and he needed to stop treating her like she might shatter. Winter came again, but this time the cold didn't feel so harsh. The house was full of warmth and life and love. One evening in late December, when Clara was a month old, Caleb and Margaret sat by the fire. The baby slept in Margaret's arms. Through the window they could see snow falling soft and silent. A year ago, Margaret said quietly, I was standing on a train platform with no hope, no future, just desperation and 4 starving children. A year ago, I was sitting in this house alone, wishing I was dead. And now, Caleb looked at his wife, at his sleeping daughter, at the life they'd built together. Now, I've never been more grateful to be alive. Margaret leaned against him. We did it. We survived. We did more than survive. We lived. We built a family. We found love. Against all odds. Against all odds, Caleb agreed. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white. But inside the Thornton Ranch house, all was warm and bright and full of hope. Spring returned to Montana as it always did, with wildflowers and rushing water and the promise of new beginnings. On the Thornton Ranch, Clara grew from a tiny infant into a chubby, smiling baby with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determination. She was adored by her older siblings, passed around like a precious doll, showered with attention. Samuel, now 12, was nearly as tall as Caleb. His voice fully changed, his shoulders broad from ranch work. He'd become Caleb's right hand, capable and reliable, a young man any father would be proud of. Ruth, now 8, had become an accomplished writer and was teaching the younger children. She still loved books, but had developed a practical streak, learning to cook and sew and manage a household. Lily, now 6, helped with the garden, and the chickens, chattering constantly, her joy infectious. She'd lost all memory of the hard times in Kansas, knew only the security and love of the ranch. And Jonah, nearly 3, followed Caleb everywhere, a shadow in miniature, insisting he was big enough to help with everything. The ranch prospered. Word had spread about the trial, about Morrison's corruption and downfall, and about the Thorntons' victory. People's attitudes had shifted. What had once been viewed with suspicion was now seen as romantic. The mail-order bride who'd married her intended's brother, the lonely rancher who'd found love again. It was the kind of story people liked to tell. Business improved. Caleb sold cattle at good prices. Margaret's garden produced abundantly. Miguel took on an assistant, a young man named Tom, who was eager to learn ranch work. One warm May morning, a wagon appeared on the road to the ranch. Margaret was hanging laundry when she noticed it, shielding her eyes against the sun. A woman climbed down holding the hand of a small child. Another child, slightly older, jumped down after them. The woman looked lost, clutching a piece of paper. She stood at the gate, uncertain whether to approach. Margaret set down her laundry basket and walked over. As she got closer, she recognized something in the woman's face. The same desperation she'd worn herself 2 years ago. The same fragile hope. "Can I help you?" Margaret asked gently. The woman jumped slightly. "I'm looking for—" "That is, I was told." She held out the paper with shaking hands. It was a letter, an advertisement for a ranch hand placed by Caleb in the Helena newspaper. But at the bottom, in Caleb's handwriting, was a note. "Families welcome. We understand hardship. We believe in second chances." Margaret smiled. "You're in the right place. I'm Margaret Thornton." "I'm Ellen Walker. I saw the advertisement and I thought, I know I'm not a ranch hand, but I can work. I can cook and clean, and I'm good with animals. My husband died last winter, and the town where we lived, they said—" Her voice broke. "They said I couldn't stay, said it wasn't proper, a woman alone with children. So I thought maybe here—" Margaret's heart ached with recognition. How many women were out there desperate and alone, judged and rejected simply for trying to survive? "Come inside," she said. "Let's get you and your children some food, and we'll talk." Over coffee and fresh bread, Ellen told her story. It was painfully familiar. Widowhood, rejection, desperation, the long journey, hoping for a chance. Caleb came in from the fields and listened quietly. When Ellen finished, he exchanged a long look with Margaret. "We can use help," he said. "Ranch is growing. We're planning to build another house come summer, expand operations. You know anything about keeping books?" "I do. I manage the accounts for my husband's store." "Good. We could use someone to handle the business side. Margaret's been doing it, but with the baby." He looked at Margaret. "What do you think?" Margaret smiled. She knew exactly what he was doing, offering the same chance someone had offered her, paying forward the kindness that had saved her life. "I think we'd be happy to have you, Ellen. There's a bunkhouse out back. Not fancy, but it's warm and dry. You and your children can stay there while we figure out the details." Ellen's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank us. Just work hard and give your children a good life. That's thanks enough." After Ellen and her children were settled, Margaret stood on the porch with Caleb, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and pink. "You did a good thing," she said. "We did a good thing. This was your idea as much as mine." "Was it?" Caleb smiled. "You think I didn't notice you suggesting we needed help with the books? You saw her and saw yourself. Wanted to give her what you got. Is that wrong?" "It's the opposite of wrong. It's exactly right." Caleb put his arm around her. "This place, this ranch, it's not just ours anymore. It's becoming something bigger. A place where people can start over. Where second chances are real." Thomas would have liked that. Yeah, he would have. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes I think that's why he brought you here. Not just for me, but to start something. To build something that matters." Margaret leaned into him, watching their children play in the yard. Samuel teaching Jonah to throw a ball. Ruth reading to Lily under a tree, Clara asleep in her cradle on the porch. 2 years ago, she'd stepped off a train with nothing but desperation and 4 starving children. She'd answered a letter from a dead man, married his brother, built a life from nothing but courage and hope. And now here she stood watching the sun set over mountains that no longer felt foreign in a place that no longer felt like exile but like home. Do you ever think about that first day? Caleb asked, reading her thoughts. When you got off the train every day. Regret. Margaret turned to look at him. At this man who'd asked her what she could do and what she'd done wrong, who'd given her a chance when no one else would, who'd fallen in love with her slowly, carefully, thoroughly. Not one, she said. Caleb kissed her forehead. Good, because I've been thinking. About what? About expanding more. About taking on more families like Ellen's. Making this ranch a real operation. Building something that lasts. That's a big dream. We've accomplished bigger things. We survived a Montana winter, won a court case, built a family. Why not dream big? Margaret laughed. Why not indeed? That night after the children were in bed and Claire was sleeping peacefully in her cradle, Margaret and Caleb stood at their bedroom window looking out at the stars. Tell me, Caleb said softly, if you could go back to that day at the train station knowing everything that would happen, all the struggles and fear and pain, would you still get on that train? Margaret didn't hesitate. In a heartbeat. Even knowing about the trial about Morrison and the judgment and all of it, even then, because it led me here, to you, to this life. She placed her hand over his heart. I came to Montana looking for shelter. I found a home. I answered an ad from the dead man and married his brother. And it was the best decision I never planned to make. Caleb pulled her close. I love you, Margaret Thornton. I love you too. Outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwoods. The mountains stood eternal against the sky. And inside the house that had once been so empty and silent, life bloomed in all its messy, beautiful complexity. 5 years later, Margaret stood in the same spot, but the view had changed. Where once there'd been one house, now there were 4. The original ranch house expanded and improved. Ellen's house, where she lived with her 2 children and the new husband she'd met in town, a widower rancher who'd needed a partner as much as she had. A bunkhouse converted into a school where Margaret taught not just her own children, but 10 others from surrounding ranches. And a new barn twice the size of the old one. The Thornton Ranch had become Thornton Station, a community hub where people came not just for work, but for hope. Samuel, now 17, managed half the ranch operations himself. He was courting Sarah's daughter and talking about building his own house come spring. Ruth, 13, helped run the school and was already receiving marriage proposals from half the young men in 3 counties. Lily, 11, was the ranch's best rider and had dreams of competing in the rodeo circuit. Jonah, 8, was his father's shadow, learning everything about ranching with the intensity of a child who'd found his calling early. And Clara, now 5, was the ranch's heart, bringing joy and laughter wherever she went, loved by everyone, spoiled by her older siblings. Margaret herself had changed too. The desperate, frightened woman who'd stepped off that train was gone, replaced by someone confident and strong. She ran the school, managed the ranch's books, and had become a voice in the community, someone people turned to for advice and help. And Caleb, now 41, had silver threading through his dark hair and smile lines around his eyes. He'd built something bigger than he'd ever dreamed. Not just a ranch, but a legacy. One evening, sitting on the porch with the sunset painting the world gold, Caleb pulled out something from his pocket, a photograph in a simple frame. Margaret recognized it immediately. Anna and young Caleb, her hand on her swollen belly, his hand on her shoulder. I found this today, Caleb said, while cleaning out the old barn. I'd forgotten I'd hidden it there. Margaret tensed, uncertain how to respond. Look at me, Caleb said gently. Look at that kid, 25 years old and so full of hope. I thought the world was going to be perfect. Thought love was enough. And then it all fell apart, and I spent 10 years wishing I'd died with her. He looked at Margaret. But if I had died, I wouldn't have met you, wouldn't have these children, wouldn't have built this life. Anna was my first love, and I'll always carry her with me. But you, Margaret, you're my truest love, the one I chose when I learned what choice really meant. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I'm not replacing her, Caleb continued. I'm honoring what she taught me. That love is worth the risk. That family is worth fighting for. That sometimes the best things come from the hardest pain. He placed the photograph on the porch rail facing the sunset. "Goodbye, Anna," he said softly. "Thank you for everything. I hope wherever you are, you know I'm happy. I hope you're happy too." Then he turned to Margaret and took her hands. "You came here with nothing, gave me everything. Thank you for saving my life. You saved mine first. Then we're even." They sat together as the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the stars began to emerge. Around them, their children played and laughed. In the houses below, lights bloomed in windows. Smoke rose from chimneys. Life abundant and messy and beautiful continued. Margaret leaned against Caleb and thought about the letter she'd answered, about Thomas Thornton, who died before she could meet him, but whose final act had brought her here, about the impossible series of chances and choices that had led to this moment. "I wonder what Thomas would think," she said, "if he could see us now." Caleb smiled. "I think he'd say it all worked out exactly as it should, even though he died, even then, because maybe that was the plan all along. Bring you here for me, build something bigger than either of us could have alone, turn grief into grace and pain into purpose." Margaret thought about that, about all the pain that had led her here. Henry's abuse, his death, the town's judgment, the desperate journey, the fear and uncertainty and struggle. All of it necessary. All of it part of the path that had brought her home. "I wouldn't change anything," she said. "Not one single moment. Not even the hard parts. Especially not the hard parts. Because they taught me I was strong enough to survive anything. Strong enough to build something new. Strong enough to love again." Caleb kissed her soft and sweet, a kiss that tasted of contentment and gratitude and deep abiding love. When they pulled apart, Clara's voice calling from inside, "Mama, Papa, come see what Jonah built." They rose and went inside into the warm house filled with laughter and life, into the family they'd built from broken pieces, into the future they'd created from impossible circumstances. Margaret paused at the door and looked back one last time at the mountains, at the stars, at the vast Montana sky. She'd come here broken, found healing, come here desperate, found hope, come here alone, found family. The letter she shouldn't have answered had given her everything she'd never known to ask for. And standing there with Caleb's hand in hers, surrounded by the life they'd built together, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, finally completely, utterly home.